Planes are meant to fly, planes they ain't supposed to fall from the sky. But if they do, they'll leave behind more than a piece or two. Planes just be flying, I know you think I'm lying. The USA, they be hiding the truth, and I ain't buying. Planes, they're meant to fly, planes, they ain't supposed to fall from the sky. But if they do, they'll leave behind more than a piece or two. They'll leave behind more, and I know you think I'm lying. The USA, they be hiding the truth, and I ain't buying. Planes, they're meant to fly, planes, they ain't supposed to fall from the sky. But if they do, they'll leave behind more than a piece or two. Planes just be flying, I know you think I'm lying. The USA, they be hiding the truth, and I ain't buying. They'll leave behind more than a piece or two. They'll leave behind more than a piece or two.
Everybody, welcome to the stream. Okay, welcome to Friday Night Fun. We are going to be doing an X Space here in just a couple minutes with Jake Chansley. We're going to be going over the DIA papers. We're going to be talking about some science. Should be a good time. So thanks for being here, everybody. While I'm getting ready here, welcome everybody who is on right away. This is kind of an impromptu stream. William, Sigmund, Noble, Mr. Hawaii Glass, Todd Turner, Jetstream Surfer, Nicole, good to see you. Hey, West. Hey, John B. Here for as long as I can stay awake, says the Blow. Welcome. Hey, Hisatu. I think I already said hi to Jess. If not, hello. Yeah, lots of solar flares, says Sigmund. I don't think that we're going to get wiped out today, so we'll see. JT, Donnie Darko, airplane engine. It is pretty damn weird. Flimsy Greenberg, how's it going? Chris DeMarco, I see you. Thanks again for that. That's a nice comment to make. Great day for fishing. Fancy Flint, good to see you. Or Flint Flancy. John Johnson, awesome. Ditch the music? Nah, we're not ditching the music. How's it going, Jack? Let's see what else we got. Richard, everybody else. How's it going, guys? Okay, so I'm waiting for the space to start up here in a second. Oh, it looks like it just started. So here we go. Hold on. Can I open this in another? One sec, guys. I got to get this set up just right. There we go. There we go. I think it's looking pretty good. Here we go.
I'm sure that he is busy, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little bit of music here while we wait. Oh, there he is. Hey, Ash. They have 40 people in the space right now. So my thinking is if all 40 people end up retweeting the space, we could get even more people in here, and then that can help us to create the demand for this technology to be released, and thus we will have a supplier. Orlando Salazar, I see you there. I don't know if Ashton asked you to come in or not. Ashton, if and when you want people to come up and get a mic, I will allow you to, by all means, do that. If you want somebody to come in, if you've told somebody to come in, that's cool. What I would like to do, though, first is kind of bounce things back and forth between yourself and myself. Let's condense this jargon and this esoteric knowledge down into language that most people can comprehend, and then kind of field the questions and stuff like that. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah. Hey, Jake, how you doing tonight, man? today, this
I'm
afternoon?
doing well, man. I'm really excited to do this.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, no, sorry it took me a second. I was just getting my stuff set up. We're live streaming as well over on YouTube and on X if you guys want to watch in addition to participate. I hadn't asked anybody else to come up, so I thought we would do it the same way we normally have. So for people who are new, Jake and I have done a number of spaces and streams about advanced technology, stuff about the MH370, and then just some other streams as well. They've all been really good. Usually our format is we go for a couple hours. For the first hour or so, usually Jake and I kind of opine about, the technology, what it means, etc. And then usually the second half or in the last 45 minutes or so, we have people come up, ask questions, what have you. So, Jake, is that cool with you if we do it that way again?
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to play a little bit of music here while we wait for people to retweet the space and share this info with others, see if we can get this room full. I certainly hope you like my choice of music. I've chosen I think, very appropriate song written by Hans Zimmer. So let's put that
Hans
on
Zimmer?
real quick while we wait. And here we go.
Okay. This is going to be good. Okay. We got a little background music, chat. When I go solo layout, can you still hear the background? Can you guys still hear the music while I have solo layout like this? People who are watching on the stream? Weird. Okay, let me see. Ooh, a little epic music. Ooh. How am I going to do this? God dang it. Hate how it always tries to clip it. I think we're going to start with the warp drives paper. Can't read it like this, though. Dun, dun, dun. If I put this up here. Okay, you guys can still hear it? Yeah. Yeah, it's very quiet. It is really quiet. I think that's just because the way he's doing it. So, okay, everybody who's in here, we're going to be doing this space today for the next couple hours. I'm going to go through some of the same stuff on these DIA papers. I may switch the view over so you guys can see the paper while I'm talking through them. Maybe not. I haven't really decided. So if you guys have seen some of the recent streams we have, it's going to be somewhat repetitious, but repetition is good for understanding the concepts. So Jake and I kind of have an agenda. It's going to be, we're going to talk about the ether, scalar physics, quantum entanglement, faster than light travel, wormholes, vortices, magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, and then quantum travel / entanglement. And then we've also potentially talked about some radar, plasma physics, semiconductors. So we've got a lot of stuff to talk about here. It's going to be good. Everybody's a critic. This is from Interstellar. Oh, interesting. Didn't know that. Good to know. Let me make this a little bigger. Twitter, supposedly has copyright strikes, but I don't think it's as harsh. People don't really enforce it on Twitter. Yeah, I can never repeat the science enough. I'm probably going to do restreams of the Thomas Bearden stuff now that we know more as well, maybe next week. Also, it's better to do those streams for me because I don't have to have so much preparation. It takes a lot of preparation for some of this stuff. Yeah, Interstellar is pretty crazy. That's where I first learned about time dilation. Pretty big. We've already got 100 people in the stream or in the space, which is pretty big. Okay. Over here all the time. Close that. Okay. Then I'll move these papers over here. Can't get this thing on the left to go away, huh? Yeah, there's no way to get that to go away. Oh, there it goes. Okay, now we're in a much better situation to read these papers. Okay, there we go. Okay. Ooh, I might have to get a beer, chat. Maybe a beer and a root beer? I don't know. So John B asked a really good question. Do you think that the ether is too much of a catch-all? No, that's the beauty of it. The thing about physics and science that's wonderful is that it's elegant. Elegant solutions that are elegant are what you want to find. You know, the fact that the ether solves the problem of dark energy that's honestly mind blowing. It really is.
For those that don't recognize the song, it's the Interstellar main theme by Hans Zimmer, which God, I love that song. Hans Zimmer's so good.
And yeah, that movie is really relevant here too. That's the first time I learned about time dilation. And I remember I watched that movie and I was like, wait a minute, you can travel to the future? Like time dilation is a real thing? Like what happens to them on the planet when they're by that black hole? And I spent like all night just like Googling it, looking it up, finding out that, yeah, like we actually tested this like decades ago. And like we sent up airplanes into like near orbit. And we sent them in opposite directions at like different altitudes or in different orbit, and said that, and we found out there was like a slight difference in the clocks that they put on them afterwards, enough to like prove that time dilation is 100% real, which means that you experience time flow based on your frame of reference, as Einstein would put it, which is that like you yourself are experiencing time at a different rate than potentially somebody else is experiencing time, which becomes very important for what we're going to talk about today when we talk about quantum entanglement, and teleportation and superluminal speeds, because that's going to come into play.
Yes, it is. This is why I chose that music. I was really kind of rocking my brain, like, what am I going to put?
Thanks, feedback.
That's the perfect one. And you're right. Time dilation is a real thing. Time is relative. Einstein told us that a long time ago, and we're, I think, just now kind of catching up. So do you want to start with the DIA documents?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay. So
a lot of the stuff we have. Yeah, go for it.
Well, I saw in the comments that somebody looked up the address that was placed on that document, and it took them to some random suburban home in Vegas, or in Nevada rather. And I'm just sitting here scratching my head, and I'm wondering, because I know that how the intelligence agencies like to do things is they will release a bunch of stuff that may very well be factual, but then they will alter the documents ever so slightly in ways that most people wouldn't realize or recognize, like the seal that they use for the agency, or the address, or what have you, or the signature of the bureaucrat that signed off on it. All of these things, or one of these things, might be off slightly or not official, and then the intelligence agency will point to these inconsistencies and say, see, this is debunked, this is bogus, even though the info in there may very well be real, or there it might be partially true, or whatever. So I'm curious about the authenticity of these things. Have you investigated thoroughly enough to identify the markers that this thing is in fact real?
Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of people have this idea, I think it's called limited hangout or something, this idea that we would throw stuff out there to just throw adversaries off, which of course we do stuff like that in general. But when you look at these scientific papers, the thing about them is that they're consistent and have real equations from Einstein and what have you. It's not like it's somebody just made up some mumbo jumbo on there. So they're written from a perspective of not an experimental perspective, but from a theoretical physics perspective. And in this sense, there's no like throwing somebody off with respect to that, because that's the stuff they describe in there is like Einsteinian and Rosenberg, physics that we see in here. What I'll say too is that I think the person that wrote them is Eric W. Davis, who, and the other part too is that they want you to think that it's stuff can't be real that they wrote, because that's also a tactical advantage. So you can almost think of it in the reverse as well, is that some of these people like Eric Davis, I have it on pretty good authority that he will come out and even just say that like, oh no, we can't warp an object, teleport an object, but he just knows like firsthand that we can, and potentially even has walked through a real Stargate himself, which is just Stargate's like, a portal is similar to warping two areas in space-time. So, you can take it or leave it in terms of believing it. But what I would say is that how we analyze fake news in general should be that we trust and verify. So we shouldn't just take the headline of what we read. We should look through the facts in it. And that's what I want to review with you guys today, is like, what's the meat and potatoes of these papers? So the ones, I'll list off what we're going to look at here today. And then you can, and I think what you realize right away as well is that there's a lot of common themes between all three papers. that would say, okay, if we're spending all this effort to write all these papers, that's a lot of work for disinformation that all lines up between 3 disparate papers. The first one is warp drive, dark energy, and the manipulation of extra dimensions. And this is really important because Einstein-Rosen ER is an Einstein-Rosen bridge, which is a wormhole. And dark energy is the stuff where we know that from based on, let's say, classically accepted physics, there was a big bang, but we know that the universe expanded faster than the speed of light. But we also think the speed of light's the speed limit. So how is that possible? This is where physicists came up with dark energy, which they think encompasses like 70% of the universe. And then the last one here is manipulation of extra dimensions, which is going to come up with this idea of the ether. And the ether is this idea that you have potentially unlimited negative energy. It could be like the canvas on which our reality is painted on, which we'll talk about here in a minute as well. The second paper, traversable wormholes, stargates, and negative energy. So we were just talking about this idea of warp drive, and now you can take this idea of having a traversable wormhole, which is, can you actually survive a wormhole if you were to go through it? And that's what this paper deals with. Stargates, which would be like taking that concept to the next level and saying like, okay, we can actually create a portal that's always there, not when we just induce like a wormhole, and then it can just be like a living thing, like the TV show Stargate. And then the last one, negative energy, is essentially like we talked about with the ether, the extra dimension. If there's unlimited negative energy, this can account for dark energy. So you could postulate that dark energy literally is equal to negative energy, and that can be the reason for why we had that expansion in the Big Bang. And then those are going to be the main ones, but there's also this third paper, and there's actually more than this as well I'm going to review, but these are the ones that are all kind of like linked together, which is anti-gravity for aerospace applications. And this one talks about something that that there's more than one type of manipulating like gravity for propulsion. A warp drive is like creating a hole within space-time itself and going from one location to somewhere else. But you can also have this idea that you could create like an impulse engine that just pushes off that negative energy essentially, or it pushes off that extra dimension. And that's what this paper digs into, but it has topics for dark energy, anti-gravitation propulsion application for dark and vacuum energy. And it also talks about something like 0 point fluctuations, which I think is just another term for, the ether extra dimension. So that's what we're going to dig into today. Jake, you have any initial comments?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the DIA gave a bogus address for their paper because they don't want to identify where their locations are, where they're doing this kind of research. Of course, if they're going to make something public, they would either redact it or put something that's not necessary, that's going to be like a false trail there. So the concepts behind what you're talking about are very real. And if we understand the laws of physics as they are practically able to be applied, then we can and will be able to do things like go through wormholes or Einstein-Rosen bridges, whatever you want to call them. The fabric of reality, from what I understand, is held together by quantum and cosmic black holes and white holes, or vortexes. And so if we learn how to traverse these vortexes and these bridges that they create in time and space, then something like what we're talking about really isn't all that far-fetched, let alone using harmonics, energy, frequency, and vibration to manifest wormholes or stargates, vortexes that allow us to traverse massive amounts of space in a very short amount of time.
Yep. And here's the thing I want to let people know ahead of time. And this I rarely like to do the trust me bro stuff, but if you've looked through my work, if you look through what Jake's talked about, I think that you'll find that we have very significant amount of evidence that the military industrial complex, potentially other governments other than the United States, but definitely the United States, is secretly way more advanced than what the public perception is. I think the public perception is that like, oh, military is just real stupid. They can't get anything done. But that's the thing. Like if you look at strategy, like when you're weak, you want to appear strong. And when you're strong, you want to appear weak. And we dropped the bomb, the nuclear bomb, 79 years ago. So, it's not like we've been doing nothing for 79 years. What I think Jake and I are proposing is that the government and potentially other governments through private labs have acquired technology that's essentially the level of breakaway civilization via, a unification theory of quantum mechanics and general relativity. And especially the quantum mechanics parts brings up a lot of more spiritual aspects like consciousness and the nature of reality and, energies and things like that, which I like to listen to Jake talk about. Then the other thing that I think when we open it up to the crowd, we can ask everyone as well is like, how do we think we got here? Like this idea of advancing that far secretly, even in an 80-year time span, begs the question of like, did we find this technology somewhere? Did we dig it up? Did some beings visit us? Did we tell ourselves from the future? Because when you start to get to faster than light travel, you start to wonder about stuff like time travel, or maybe other answers that are out there. So I think it's going to be a fun conversation here.
I totally agree. And all of those things are plausible and on the table. So let's kind of dive into the nuts and bolts of this stuff, if you don't mind. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, I got it ready to go. So I'm going to start with just some overviews of some of the concepts from the warp drives, dark energy, and manipulation of extra dimensions. So as I already mentioned, a warp drive kind of functions like an Einstein-Rosen bridge, a wormhole, which is a connection between one point and another. It means that we can achieve superluminal relativistic speeds. And when I say that, it means that if you were the person who was going through the wormhole or object going through it, it would look like going through a doorway. But if you are the person who is looking at that wormhole, it's going to look like that person just went from one location to another location within the blink of an eye. And this is the kind of travel that we would need in order to be able to go interstellar distances, because even the closest star to us is 4 light years away. It means it's so far away, it takes light to take 4 years to get from there to here. If we were to use conventional rockets, it would take hundreds and hundreds of years to get to the nearest star that's out there. So we really need something like this in order to be able to achieve those types of speeds. And then in addition to that, we wonder, okay, what is a warp drive? What does that actually mean? What's the physics that we're talking about? So if you've seen Star Trek, we're talking about Star Trek warp drive. Literally the same thing, Alcubierre drive. Alcubierre was a Mexican physicist who came up with this paper of how we could achieve warp drive in like 1994, I want to think. So we're talking about 30 years ago. It's not that long ago. And the idea here is that you're bending space in front and behind your object to create essentially a warp bubble around your object. When you put your object in a warp bubble, now it's displaced entirely from space-time as we perceive it. But this is not a situation where you are like going to some other bizarro dimension. It's more of like a shortcut between 2 points. The idea that all points in space and time as we perceive them are connected by the extra dimension. And how can that make sense? The answer there is that if you were to strip away our reality to the extra dimension, the ether, as I like to call it, we're bringing the ether back, the speed of light is no longer constant anymore. The speed of light is now potentially infinitely fast. Tesla measured it supposedly at 50 times what we consider to be the speed of light. So now that speed limit that we were talking about in terms of how long it takes to get to another star system, 4 light years, now it becomes instantaneous potentially if all points in the universe are connected. So this is a huge jump up from the idea of what we have from propulsion. And this is why there's so much resistance and why this concept is so paradigm shifting, is because we are still using chemical rocket propulsion. The next step up from that would be some type of electrogravitic propulsion that just like Star Trek impulse drive, where you're just like pushing off of the vacuum. This is what we're talking about here with warp drive, is like you're just literally like teleporting to another location. So it's huge. Now, I'll bring up a couple more things and then I'll let Jake jump in on this one. So we need something called negative energy in order to produce a wormhole bubble. Now, there was a recent paper that just came out a week ago that says we think we can do it with normal matter energy and that we don't need negative energy. But if we do need negative energy, then we would expect it to look similar to a black hole, which is an absorption of all. It's where the mass is so strong that its absorption of even light cannot escape from it. And the main difference between a black hole and a wormhole is that a wormhole doesn't have an event horizon. So in the movie Interstellar, Matthew McConaughey falls into a black hole. In the real world, he would have been ripped to shreds because of the gravitational forces. And the moment you go through the event horizon, the gravity is so strong that not even light can escape. So there's no way to ever get out of it. Now, in a wormhole, there's no event horizon. So that means you can have this absorption of energy event, but you're not going to get crushed in it, which is really big. It means that wormholes are humanly traversable. Yeah, and then the way that we know that there is dark energy or negative energy is something called the Casimir effect. And if you were just to take 2 plates and stick them next to each other. I think copper plates, or there may be different materials that we can use. I'm still learning a little bit, but if you take two plates and stick them close together to one another, a force or a attractive force will occur, and those plates will stick together. So this is like a negative pressure that we can see exists, and they say that it's because of quantum fluctuations in the vacuum. And I would suggest that perhaps it's because there is an extra dimension, and when that happens, what they say is there's certain wavelengths can't fit between the space between the plates, and that's why it occurs. Now, if you can scale this up and find a way to utilize that energy on a much larger scale, then you might be able to achieve the negative energy densities that you need for, say, a wormhole. So the Casimir effect is something you want to remember for sure if you're trying to understand the physics behind how this is possible. And then extra spatial dimensions. So right now we're trying to explain everything in terms of quantum fluctuations and these virtual particles, which my new phrase is that this is just the ether with extra steps, because the ether potentially has unlimited negative energy in it if there is like a canvas that our reality is painted on. And with unlimited negative energy, now it's just a matter of how do we tap into it? And it begs the idea of free energy, which we can talk about later. But Kaluza, back in 1919, came up with a unification theory of gravity and electromagnetism, which involved adding an additional spatial dimension to general relativity and populating this extra dimension with two mathematical concepts called a vector potential and a scalar potential. And this is the part where the theory got added to Kaluza Klein, but this is important because somebody has already come up with this idea of adding an extra dimension, and Tesla had come up with the idea of the ether as well. And this is how they were able to figure out how we can take stuff that's very small, these quantum fluctuations, and how we can have it make sense with respect to stuff that we see that's very large, general relativity that's out there. I would say that we had figured out the answer 105 years ago in 1919. And ever since then, we've just been trying to build on physics that made no sense. And this is the reason why public physics can't explain stuff like dark matter and dark energy. It's because we just threw out this idea of creating this extra dimension. The last thing I want to say on this one, oh no, okay, so then the other thing is the energy requirements. So I think there's three ways to solve the problem, these massive energy requirements. Now we need negative energy, which if we have an ether, we have the answer to negative energy. But how do you get enough negative energy to be able to create a warp bubble around your object? Three ways. One way is that one of the equations, Dr. Jacques Sarfati proposed that we can reduce c, the speed of light, which is one of the requirements we need for energy. And you know the speed of light is a huge number. So if we can reduce that number in the equation, then we can reduce the amount of energy that we need for a warp bubble significantly. And I posted a clip like last week where it was proposed by somebody else on the panel with the alien scientist. I think his name is Santiago. If I'm saying that wrong, I apologize. That we could potentially use a plasmoid for that. So plasma research in physics is another aspect of this that I think the public doesn't really realize how advanced it is. But if you can use a plasmoid, which is like an exotic vacuum, think of like ball lightning. We call them exotic vacuum objects. Some object like that that's a self-sustaining ball of plasma, that can actually reduce the requirement we need for the energy. The other option that we can do is we can create the shell, the bubble, very thin. So imagine the difference between a very thick shell around your object and a very thin one. And the answer is when we're warping space-time and creating a bubble to displace an object, our shell can be extremely thin. It can just be a tiny, thin shell. So this significantly reduces the negative energy requirement. And then what Dr. Salvatore Paez said to me directly in my Hard Truths podcast is that we can amplify energy as well. If you read his high-frequency gravitational wave generator patent, it says that you can amplify energy to such a degree that you can destroy a planet or asteroid, or a planetoid or asteroid. Now, how is that possible? If you look at Coulomb's law, which is how much force you can generate from electric charges, if you were to take like forces or like charges and jam them together, the electric force increases exponentially based on the distance as it gets reduced, because the denominator is distance squared. So the more that number goes down, the more your force exponentially increases. So we might have three ways. We might be able to reduce the energy requirement. We might be able to make our shell really thin, and we might be able to produce basically unlimited energy through exponentially increasing it. So I think that wormholes, personally, based on this paper, and you can do your own analysis, seem like they could be practical. We just need the idea of an ether to be real. And then we need to have our very advanced plasma research. And the next thing you know, we've got the makings for a warp bubble. What are your thoughts, Jake?
Well, first of all, very well explained. That the fact that there's multiple ways of doing this, I think, is indicative that the understanding of physics is one that becomes
Yes.
all encompassing and allows for multiple ways to, shall we say, hack the system or use this understanding in mathematics and harmonics to traverse massive amounts of space and therefore time. And if time is its own like little dimension, now then that would make sense. One of the things that I liked, an analogy that I like to draw for people, is that when we talk about these warp bubbles and the traversing of the ether or the traversing of this other dimension, the reason why we see, for example, this object pop up in one spot and then a couple of minutes later pop up in another is because what's happening is that this field that is around this object allows it to access this other dimension and essentially skip across the dimension of time the way that a rock can skip across the surface of water. And you'll see the ripples where if you're like a fish in the water, you will see the ripple of where the stone hits, but you're never going to really see the stone as it's flying through the air because that is this other dimension that's outside of the water, right? So you're just seeing these craft skip across the dimension of time and space like a rock skips across water. Now, when it comes to things like the ether or even things like dark energy or dark matter, I am proposing that this negative energy that you're talking about, that is not necessarily visible or detectable with the limited amounts of tools that we have at our disposal in the public, is in one way or another the vibratory nature to creation itself. In that, if we factor in something like cymatics, right? Cymatics is the use of sound to create certain patterns, especially in certain mediums like water or grains of rice on a speaker, grains of salt on a metal plate, what have you. And when the vibration is put through these mediums, then the vibration of this field, this cymatic field, ends up moving the matter, the physical objects, through vibration into a very specific pattern based on this much larger field. And so it is my contention that what we are witnessing when we look at things like dark matter or dark energy, or what you're calling negative energy, is actually the vibration of creation and the movement of physical objects or energy into a pattern. And the dark energy that we're seeing, the negative energy, is actually the vibration of this cymatic frequency that is moving physical objects around in time and space in this extra dimensional element to the universe. Now, if everything is quantum entangled, which it is, then that means that everything around the universe and within this negative energy space is interconnected. Therefore, if we understand the vibration of this larger cymatic field, then we can traverse across space and time using this vibratory frequency to journey from one galaxy to another or one galactic supercluster to another, because now we're using this extra dimension of this negative energy to do the journeying, as opposed to trying to journey in between the grains of rice or the grains of salt, what we would think of as stars, planets, and galaxies. I do see the requests that are there. We will get to the requests. Please keep your requests active. We're not trying to ignore you. We're just going back and forth, me and Ashton, on this for a little bit, and then we're going to open things up. Now, when it comes to things like vortexes and wormholes and stuff like that, one of the ways that I like to kind of help people to understand in layman's terms how this stuff works is similar to a guitar. You have a guitar, for example, with 6 strings, and you can hit one of the strings without putting your finger on any of the frets, and you will get a certain sound. But if you go to the string above it or below it, and you place your finger on a certain fret and then you pluck that string, you will get the exact same sound. You will get the exact same harmonic frequency that you would get by plucking the string above or below it if it was just without being touched on any of the frets. So in this way, if we look at the universe like these layers of dimensions, then or strings, right, based on certain frequencies of vibration or densities of matter or energy, then we can then liken this metaphor of the guitar and wormholes to the idea of placing our finger on the fret
notes. Sorry for the
of a certain string to produce the exact same harmonic resonance that you would get based on where it is that our world or our string would be. And then if you can do that, you can then traverse from one dimension to another simply based on harmonics. And the holding your finger down on a fret, or technology in our case, using technology to create a certain frequency that can then allow us to journey into this extra dimension that is quantum entangled to the rest of the universe. Does that make sense to you, Ashton? Am I on point here?
Yeah, I think you are. For me, the big question about like frequency and what have you, that's the part where I'm not really sure, but I do know that resonance is extremely important, and that to me speaks to the idea of frequency. I think you hit on a couple of really good points, and I want to also, basically say that the analogy for skipping a stone on water is a really good one, especially when it comes to this idea of what are UFOs that we see out there. And I'm pretty much open to anything on that front, but if this technology that we're talking about, being able to create wormholes, warp drive, et cetera, is real, it does open the door to there being a lot of answers for the non-human intelligence question. And if other beings other than us, than humans, have this type of technology, people wonder, what would it look like? What does it look like if I'm looking to seeing something out there? Maybe why don't we see more UFOs out there if there is life out there? Well, maybe they've discovered this technology and they're just skipping across the galaxy, the universe, and this is why we don't see them floating around, because they're not using conventional propulsion the way that we would think. And the question there is, okay, well, what do you use as your direction of travel? How do you determine where you go? And that part is something that I think I believe I have a pretty good concept and grasp of now because of the investigation I've been looking into. It's something called phase conjugation. And this is, again, the idea that you can have your waves kind of cancel each other out perfectly or be in harmony with one another and amplify one another. The idea that if you have two waves, you just line them up exactly over one another or an exact opposite orientation of one another. And if you do this and you have a 0-point system, which would be a system where you have your vectors going against one another perfectly. Your 0-point system could be like two lines intersecting or going at one another. Like imagine two cars that are driving right at each other. Or the other way that it can work is you could have like a triangle where you have a triangle where, like, let's say 3 cars are all driving towards one common midpoint. This would be your 0-point system. And the way that the physics would say that would work is that you would have that 0-point system, basically what we mentioned with Coulomb's law, you would have that system collapse on itself, the distance close, and now you have this electrical exponential increase of energy. Now 3 points in space-time is the minimum number you need to make a 2-dimensional object, like a triangle. So if you were to imagine that you were going to warp an object, then 3 would be the minimum number you need. If you had 2, you just drew a line. You can't get something. Your wormhole would have no depth or have no face to it that you could go through. And then the question is, okay, well, how do you determine the vector of travel based on that? Okay, you went through a wormhole. Where are you going? Well, the answer there is twofold. If you have, let's say, 3 objects that are spinning around, you have something in electrical engineering called the right-hand rule, which goes to this idea of vortexes, which Jake was just talking about. And if you take your right hand then and you curl your fingers and you point your thumb and then you point your finger, you can determine the electric field direction as well as the magnetic field as the curl. And then you have this vector based on where, I think it's your thumb. Hopefully I'm not saying this wrong. It's either your pointing finger or your thumb, where the vector would determine your direction of travel. And so if you were to look at your object and say, okay, well, they're spinning clockwise, then the vector of travel would be backwards from wherever the object is if you're looking straight on it. And this could determine which way you go. Now, entanglement could also determine exactly where you go. So if you imagine that you have those 3 objects spinning around and they're creating a wormhole, now you send another object, a 4th object, an orb, let's say, somewhere else. And now when those objects converge, you have that 4th orb shoot a beam at the three other objects, at the center point of those three other objects, and it creates a phase conjugate, which is an exact reflection back the other way. So you can imagine a rubber band snapping, and then in that way you have entangled your object to your pump waves, as they would call them, using phase conjugation. And next thing you know, your objects goes from one location to the other. Not even just the object, but all the energy around where the object was at in space-time as well is now just moved from one location to another in your warp bubble. The other thing I want to point out real quick is an analogy of the stress in the medium, which I really like a lot because I think it's true, which is if we take classical physics and we say if we pull on like a rubber band or a rope in two different directions, like tug of war, and we pull equally on both sides, then that rope's not going to move left or right. It's going to stay right in the middle there. It's not going to move. We could pull twice as hard, and it would still, the sum total of the forces would still be 0 in the middle. And then if we pull 4 times as hard, same deal. But if we pull that rope super, super hard, or this rubber band that I have in my hand really, really hard, the rubber band's going to snap. It's going to snap in half. So what that means is that even though we've canceled our forces on both sides, it doesn't mean that there's nothing left. It means that there is a stress in the medium. So if your medium's a rope or this rubber band and I'm playing it, and this goes to Jake's idea of the guitar and the sound with the guitar, is that if I'm pulling on this, this is how you create this stress in the medium. So now instead of a rubber band or a rope or what have you, let's imagine that it's space-time itself, that we're pulling on space-time itself in both directions. We're making our force equal to 0. What's left? What's left is the stress in the medium of space-time. Well, what is the stress in the medium of space-time? The answer is gravity. Gravity is the stress on the medium of space-time. So this idea of how we can use something called scalar potentials, which is the stress in the medium, to produce gravity. Now, why haven't we been able to figure that out? Why? I mean, it's 2024. How have we not figured out how gravity and propulsion works if it's that simple? The answer is because we've forgotten how the equations were initially written by James Clerk Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell wrote 20 electrical engineering equations that had the scalar potential in them. In addition to the fact that we just read about that paper where Kaluza-Klein came up with a scalar potential in your extra dimension. And then what happened is Oliver Heaviside came in and said, no, that's too complicated. I'm going to reduce this down to 4 equations. And in doing so, we lost how to manipulate the scalar potential, the stress and medium. And the saddest part about this is that even with Oliver Heaviside's equations, we can still do everything that we're doing right now from electrical engineering or electromagnetic perspective. So we can have streams, we can be talking through a microphone, you guys can be hearing it, all this stuff, TV, everything that's cool. We just forgot how to manipulate gravity. So I would then suggest the idea that the military government especially has figured this out a long time ago. And they have just had no reason to tell the world. All the textbooks in the world are potentially written incorrectly, and the people in power probably know that, and they keep it that way for whatever reason, for greed, for geopolitical purposes, for defense purposes, whatever it is. So let's see. The last thing, actually, that's it. That's all my things. So Jake, good job on that part. Any other comments on that before we go to the next one?
Well, yeah, because you brought up the 3 points, like the triangular element to this, and this brings me to the MH370. And the video, the live that I was watching that you did, where you were talking about how it is that these 3 objects rotating around the airplane in a perfect waveform, and each of them emitting a very specific electromagnetic frequency. And when they all came together, it like created this pressure that allowed for the creation of a wormhole, or created a double torus field within a double torus field that was like this wormhole that allowed the plane from both the back and the front to be basically transported to another location. So is that kind of how like is that how this is working, that you have these 3 objects that you were talking about, because you created another dimension, right? You can't just have 2 objects because then it's just a straight line. But if you have these 3 objects and they are rotating, creating, and they're all kind of like feeding into this electromagnetic potential, and then they end up coming together and then creating almost like a pressure wave or stress in the medium of space-time itself, then that ends up creating like almost like a double torus field, or a collapse of this energetic potential, which allows for this vortex or this wormhole to open up and for this object to then traverse through it, right?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, you honestly nailed it. So I will just give a little bit more context on some of it as well, is so that when we want that to achieve then that scalar potential, which is the stress in the medium, the gravity, what we need to do is we need to zero out our magnetic and or electric potentials. So instead of just there being electromagnetism, we have this idea of electrogravitics. So if we can manipulate our magnetic potential to be zero, so we can take our magnetic, normally a magnet, like if you imagine the earth is going to have like bend around from the top to the bottom, if we can zero that out somehow, and or zero out the electric potential, then what we're left with is the gravity manipulation, the stress in the medium. The same way where if I'm pulling on the rubber band on both sides, cancel it out, it's not that there's nothing left, there's the stress left. So how do we do that? The answer seems to be something called a torus, a donut shape. So make a circle with your hands. The donut shape is what allows for that to have a zero, at least at a certain point, a zero magnetic potential, which can create that stress in the medium that we need. So that would be the toroid. Whenever you hear the word torus, toroid, what have you. So when you look at plasma physics as well, you'll see that shape come up all the time. Now that you guys have heard about it, you're going to see it everywhere. So when in MH370 videos, we see these orbs spinning around the plane. And early on, I was able to just tell by looking at it that we're looking at some kind of field, like a plasma field there. And then we can tell from the heat signature in those videos, that's what we're looking at. So you can imagine the idea that there is a toroid inside of there that is producing that that plasma field. And that's why we actually see the heat signature in those orbs. A really weird heat signature looks like a Tesla symbol. And that's exactly what would be predicted based on a toroid with a plasma field. So they themselves are a torus. They themselves are a donut. And what they're doing is they're producing a higher level torus, a fractal torus. So people wonder, what is a fractal moment? What is a fractal torus? It means just something inside of something. So like a toroid inside of a toroid, a donut inside of a donut. So you've got your donut, your sphere, your orb, and they're spinning around the plane in a 0-point field, and they're producing a higher level toroid between them. You could draw a circle between them, and now that is the electromagnetic field that they are creating around them. And why are they doing that? Because they're going to create a gravity wave. They're going to manipulate gravity, the stress in the medium around the center point of their formation, which is, in the case of the MH370 videos, a 777. And just like Jake said, they're going to create a gravity wave, which then the question is, okay, where does it go? And how far does it go? And how are you limited? And to something else that you mentioned earlier, Jake, is this idea of entanglement. I love the idea that everything in space and time is connected and we just don't perceive it, because I think it answers a lot of questions about consciousness, even some stuff about like people having like psychic powers or experiences like remote viewing and stuff like that. And I think that even with this technology, for a lot of people, when they first heard this, they went, no, not possible. And I did too. And then now I'm like, oh my God, not only is it possible, I think we've already had it. And to me, the question is, how far can you take this? How far can you advance this? Like a lot of people kind of think of technology like a stepping stone, but it's kind of like a thing where you can get a lot better at it, like a lot better. So even if we have this technology right now, you can imagine 1,000 years of advancing this technology, we might go from a situation where we can produce these kinds of effects with radar on the ground. People talk about like Antarctica, HARP, stuff like that. Those could be used for these types of scalar waves, to then putting them on satellites, where then we can shoot beams down from the sky, and they're at their intersection point, we can, either create energy or remove energy at a distance. And then the next step beyond that would be that you make some orbs that can float around themselves that are self-sustaining, and that they have beams on them. So now anywhere you want on the planet, you just deploy the orbs and you can create those effects anywhere on the planet without the restriction of line of sight, like with the radars on the ground or with the satellite. And then what's after that? That's the real kicker, is that you can imagine, well, if every point, like Jake just said, is quantum entangled, and it's just a matter of tapping into that entanglement, then maybe you could just create, literally beam me up, Scotty, put you from any point in the universe to any other point in the universe, the snap of a fingers. And this opens the door to the next paper as well, which we'll also talk about. Well, why couldn't you create a Stargate then? Like, why can't I just go down to my basement, create a giant Stargate, and connect that to anywhere else I want in the universe, create a Stargate on the other side? And now I don't need to induce the wormhole. The wormhole is just permanently open however long I want. Or maybe I drop an electric charge through it, and now it just opens up, just like in the TV show, Stargate SG-1 or what have you. So I would challenge people to think that, like, not only is this technology really possible, but if it is, then let your imagination like push how far you could take the technology. I think it truly is essentially the equivalent of magic. Go ahead, Jake.
Well, I wanted to address something. You said something earlier about the vector. I think you said vector potential, right?
Yeah, so like the direction of travel, simply.
Right. Okay. So if you look into sacred geometry and the notion that the vector equilibrium is the fundamental building blocks of all of reality, because it is mathematically stable, because this, and I have it up in the nest here, it's the image that is in the top right hand corner of the assets that I have in the nest. The vector equilibrium is basically two equally powerful forces colliding together, and because they're equally powerful, they create a stable structure in the dimensions of space and time. And at the center of the vector equilibrium is the energy that creates all things. So everything is made up of energy. Everything is made up of the exact same fundamental parts, whether they be quantum particles or celestial bodies. They are all made up of energy. And in this way, this kind of explains quantum entanglement, because if everything is coming from the same source, then it would kind of make sense why it is that just for the sake of balance of the universe itself, we would have quantum entanglement. Now, because the vector equilibrium is a stable geometric structure in space and time, it can be built on infinitely, endlessly, from quantum to cosmic. And that's why I have in the bottom left-hand corner of that post up in the nest, I have an image where the vector equilibrium is built on top of itself over and over and over again. This is where we get the whole star tetrahedron or Merkaba and the double torus field. Because when these two equally powerful forces collide, they don't just stop. They don't just stay there. They actually begin to rotate around one another, and we get a clockwise spiral going upward and a counterclockwise spiral going downward. And this creates the double torus field. Now, when we talk about things like the creation of like an anti-gravity field or some sort of a quantum wave affecting field around a craft, it is in fact a double torus field that has accessed this 0 point energy, this energy at the core of the fundamental core of all things. It has accessed that, and it is basically through that accessing that other dimension and then enveloping itself with that frequency or with that extra dimensional waveform. And then this allows the craft to go from a physical object, a macro physical object, to then using the quantum entangled nature of reality and this extra dimension to begin to traverse the universe or space and time. Now, that being said, when we're talking about like these vector points or these double torus fields, if everything in the universe, whether it be stars, galaxies, the universe itself, atoms, quantum particles, if they're all based on the same sacred geometric design, then if we can learn to match certain energetic frequencies, then we can vibrate reality or space-time itself. We can manipulate that to the point where we can journey from A to B and back again instantaneously, because we're essentially tapping into the quantum entangled sacred geometric structure of reality itself, and then using that understanding to circumnavigate to these higher dimensions. So if you look at the asset I have in the nest and you look at how it is that the vector equilibrium can be built on top of itself, then what you're seeing with these different layers of the vector equilibrium is different frequencies of energy, different amounts of energy being pulled to and through space and time to create certain physical objects. So the sun has a lot more energy than the earth. The galaxy has a lot more energy than the sun. Quantum particles have a lot less energy than atoms, and atoms have less energy than molecules, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea here is that we have all of these different infinitely nested quantum or cosmic vibrations of energy that are cycling this infinite amount of energy within the universe to and through themselves, and all the way down to, on a quantum level, all the way down to the same omnipresent source, which is at the core of the vector equilibrium, at the core of all existence. So if human beings are kind of like right in the middle of the infinitely large and the infinitely small, and if we have this double torus field that surrounds our body, the electromagnetic field, if we have a vector equilibrium within our heart, and that's what creates this double torus field, this electromagnetic field around us, then we have the ability to create a technology that allows that electromagnetic field to traverse to these higher dimensions or these lower dimensions and circumvent the illusion of separation, circumvent the illusion of space and time. Is all this making sense to you in context of what it is that you're saying there, Ash?
Yeah, so there was this letter that was addressed to me on a YouTube channel that just randomly got created, had a couple other weird, pretty well-produced AI stories in it. But then there was a letter to me. It was about the case I was digging into. And it was about a lot of the science that we've been talking about too, which is weird. It mentioned the idea of a magic FedEx, which was very similar to this idea of like warp drive or what have you. And near the end of it, it said, it was like telling me to find a guy that was on Joe Rogan but got his episode pulled. And I just thought that was weird, and said, find this guy that's this gray bearded man. And I had no idea what the hell it was talking about, but I was like, I'm interested. This is crazy. And it mentioned this idea of sacred geometry. And I had never heard of sacred geometry before that. And I looked into it a little bit, and it looks just like what Jake has up in the nest up here at the top, with these really simplistic geometric structures and shapes. Which one thing you can imagine there is this idea of 0-point structures. So, like we have two lines intersecting, or a perfectly equilateral triangle. You can build that up into different shapes, and there's many different ways you can create a 0-point system. And then also the idea of a torus, which potentially could be itself a sacred geometry type shape, because it has just natural properties that are consistent with how maybe even the universe was created from something that was relatively simple itself. But the letter said, so to find this guy, the gray bearded man. So we find out right away that it's Randall Carlson, that there was an episode he was on with Malcolm Bendel, and that he's huge into sacred geometry. And my followers found it out within like hours or less. And so I look into him. I find out my buddy Bob Greenier, who does low energy nuclear reactions, cold fusion, he's hanging out with Malcolm Bendel in the Maldives like the same day this video drops. And to me at that point, it was just like, now you're living in like a mystery movie, pretty bizarre. And he'd been working on plasmoids, exotic vacuum objects, same exact thing that we were seeing in these videos, same exact thing that we think we need to reduce the energy requirement for a wormhole. To me, that's a pretty damn weird coincidence. And so I haven't talked to Randall, but I have talked to Malcolm. But if you guys watch a lot of Randall's work, he's been on Joe Rogan a number of times. He talks a lot about how important sacred geometry is. And one of the weird things about the letter was it said, the gray bearded man might not even know how important the stuff he's talking about really is. And when you look at Randall's stuff, he's a lot into like some of the old ancient archaeology type stuff and the pyramids and things like that. But he doesn't talk too much about like the high science aspects of it. Like, can you create like exotic vacuum object, a ball lightning with this, and what else can you do? The other thing that the letter mentions is the idea that what it requires to do these magical types of things, like teleporting an aircraft, are simple structures and low energy phase transitions. And this kind of brings up the same thing that we just mentioned with respect to that first paper, which is this idea that you could potentially lower the amount of energy that you need. Maybe you don't need this huge infinite amount of energy to be able to achieve some of these magical type effects. Maybe it's a matter of efficiency and using very simple structures to create very efficient ways of forming a phase transition, which is what we see in those videos happen to the plane. We're not looking at a black hole because we don't see everything get sucked in. There's no event horizon. It's a phase transition that's happening. That's really what you could argue a warp drive or wormhole is, which I think they're just synonymous with one another at this point. And then for me, the reason why I haven't harped too much on this, a lot of people might go, whoa, this is like, you have like the answer for how you could achieve this stuff, is that for me, I like to try to build up from a foundation, a basis. For a lot of people, even what we're talking about right now is too much. So for me, it's like, I don't really care how it's possible that we can warp an aircraft. What I want to know is just show me like literally what it takes to make it happen. And if that's a torus or if that's some other sacred geometry shape, great. I don't care. To Jake's point, that's why I think he's like the yin to my yang, is that Jake will then go, okay, well, these shapes also from the esoteric aspect are like the nature and shape of the universe. This is like explains consciousness and potentially like our internal energy, like why we even are alive, why we even exist, why consciousness even exists. It can even just be like, if people are searching for the meaning of life, you can look at it from a couple perspectives. One of the ways that I look at it personally is just my belief, is this idea that our bodies are like avatars and like our soul comes from this, cosmic ether, if you want to think of it, or a higher dimension, and it manifests itself in our physical bodies as we see it. I mean, that's what it feels like to me when I'm living. And the other way you could look at it is this idea that the ether itself, if there is this extra dimension that our reality is painted on, that we're constantly interacting with, all space-time is, that is almost like the underlying computer code of the program that we're in, the holographic principle, as people would say. And some people go, no, we don't live in a simulation. I would say, don't look at it like that at all. I mean, we know we're alive. We know we're interacting right now. And that's what life is enjoying these moments that we're having right now with one another. So there's the world universe being a holographic principle doesn't diminish any value of life. In fact, I argue, and this is one of the more surprising things, I'm going to make a post about it later, is that the more I dug into the science, the more spiritual I became, because I came to the conclusion that like our reality is a construct, which means that somebody would have had to design it, which means that there would have to be a creator. So anyway, go ahead, Jake.
Well, no, I'm right there with you. And the funny thing is, you mentioned about the yin yang, is that, yeah, I totally get that. What you're saying about the yin to your yang, for sure, bro. And I would like to take that a step further, because it made me think about how the double torus field technically is a 3D yin yang. It is a positive and negative electromagnetic field. And the yin yang symbol is a 2-dimensional image of this 3-dimensional electromagnetic field. Now, if the entirety of the universe is based off of electromagnetic fields being infinitely nested with one another, which Hello Cypher is down there requesting, I want to bring him up when we open things up for questions, because Ashton, I think you're really going to like this guy. He blew my mind when it came to the science behind the things that I'm talking about conceptually. He understands the science and has done a lot of investigating, much like yourself. And I think that the three of us together would be like the 3 points of the triangle here. And if we came together, we could create a wormhole, man. I'm telling you. But the yin-yang field, the electromagnetic field, because everything is infinitely nested with these electromagnetic fields of higher or lower frequencies. An atom has a yin-yang field, right? The galaxy has a yin-yang field. Our planet, the sun, etc. All of these yin-yang fields, our physical body has a yin-yang field. Then this is how the universe remains in balance. This is how positive and negative charges and quantum entanglement all correlate with one another. And coming back to what you were saying about like negative energy or dark matter, then we could basically use this understanding of the yin-yang, positive and negative, to say travel from one part of the galaxy to the other, if the universe is in fact encapsulated by a what we could say maybe universal or multiversal yin-yang field. And if, for example, matter is the positive to this electromagnetic field, or the yin, then the negative energy could be the yang to this yin. And then if we learn how to traverse through the yin, we can move anywhere in the yang. Or I'm sorry, if we learn how to traverse in the yang, we can move anywhere in the yin. If we learn how to traverse through the negative energy, we can move anywhere in the positive energy, because this electromagnetic yin-yang double torus field is intimately connected. It's quantum entangled. And if we understand the vector equilibrium and how it's able to be built on top of itself, then we look at that asset that I've placed in the nest there, then each of these different levels to this vector equilibrium are different harmonic wave vibrations that if we match them, then we could very well be able to traverse in that dimension and then pop up elsewhere within physical space-time. And that's pretty much all I have to say. I like that yin yang thing you said.
Now we've been nailing it. So yeah, let's go to the next paper. So the second paper, and this one will go a little bit quicker because a lot of it, what you realize when you read these papers, and I definitely recommend everybody out there read them for yourselves, is that there's so many common elements that they talk about. So this one is traversable wormholes, stargates, and negative energy. And we've already talked about a lot of this. Is that negative energy is potentially just the exact equivalent to dark energy. And negative energy is essentially what the ether, the extra dimension, is filled with, which is why we can have dark energy exist, why the universe can expand faster than the speed of light. And then the idea of traversable wormholes is this idea that we can survive, that we can walk through the wormhole. And this paper has equations in there that show that you won't be ripped to shreds. The gravitational forces of the wormhole won't rip you to shreds. But it also does mention the idea of not touching basically like the edge of the wormhole. So you don't want to be like half in, half out of the wormhole. You want to be fully inside that shell, and you don't want to touch it. Now, in your perspective, it would appear as though you're just like walking right through it. So it'd be very tough. But imagine like not touching the doorway. You know, you don't want to touch the door when you go through. And why this is kind of interesting to read from the paper is that you can imagine the idea of the Philadelphia experiment. And in the Philadelphia experiment, supposedly it didn't go very well. And what they were trying to do with the Philadelphia experiment is they were trying to cloak the ship from electromagnetic signals using extremely powerful degaussers. And you imagine that if they created a field and they didn't realize the field didn't encapsulate the entire ship, and maybe it went through parts of the ship, any of those people that were touching that shell, like that's why you have these pictures where people are like stuck in the wall with half their arm going out, or why you like messed up their brains, because this kind of stuff can like mess up your internal, thinking, your internal organs, all kinds of stuff out there, which is the idea of like Havana syndrome and some of that stuff. But just imagine it like extremely powerful. So I think that this technology could go all the way back to 1943, which was the Philadelphia experiment. And that is potentially when we accidentally figured out, oh, whoops, we actually can manipulate gravity. We didn't realize that. We screwed up when we rewrote those equations. And ever since then, government's just been improving it for decades and decades and decades. And potentially when quantum computers came out, or super advanced supercomputers, that's when it just took off. Where like now you can like literally just have a supercomputer having these orbs create these perfect triangle formations that, no one could actually fly like that. To produce some of these effects that otherwise we wouldn't be perfect enough to be able to recreate. Because like Jake said, a lot of this has to do with harmonic resonance and things like that. But a computer can pull that off, no problem. So the other thing this paper mentions is the idea of stargates. And so a stargate is the same application of the technology of a wormhole, but now you're making a permanent gate that is permanently entangled between two locations. In fact, some might argue that's even easier than creating a wormhole. Is that if you can entangle 2 points, you set down where those 2 things are, they're entangled. Then the only other issue is you don't want decoherence to occur. And decoherence is what happens with supercomputers. So supercomputers use entanglement themselves. And the problem with it is you have to keep them very cold. And even like disturbances like observing them, like the double slit experiment, just looking and measuring, can break down the coherent states of the qubits. And if you get decoherent, now your thing doesn't work anymore. Because now imagine you're looking at your Stargate and somebody got too close to it with a magnet or whatever, and now your Stargate collapses. That's the idea, is that you need to be very stable. But it was a recent paper that said that they might have figured out a way to keep these types of systems coherent long enough where you could create like real, potentially macroscopic quantum effects, teleportation. And quantum teleportation has been proven. It's been proven for actually many years at this point. There's even records for how far people have teleported energy, or potentially in the future information with faster than light communication using that. So stargates are something that I would have thought would have been completely science fiction. And now I look at it, I think, wow, that's probably one of the more trivial aspects of this type of physics and technology that's out there. And it would be funny if there's people that actually have been through them. And there's some pretty fun animations in there where people stick their arm through one side and then the wormhole comes out the other, and it looks all bizarre and funky. We already talked about the no event horizon with respect to a wormhole, but that's another one of the big requirements that everybody should know, because a lot of people think you're going to get ripped to shreds, and you absolutely will not be ripped to shreds if you go through a wormhole or a Stargate. The energy requirement, again, is the big limitation. If you go and watch, if you like Google wormholes, warp drive, this type of stuff, you'll find that physicists will say that it is possible. What they say, though, is that the energy requirement's not realistic, that it would take this huge amount of energy. But this is where we're already proposing solutions right now in an X space. We're saying that you can potentially reduce the energy requirement through two ways, potentially by being able to slow the speed of light down, which if you guys Google looking, checking out stuff like where that slows the speed of light down, there's actually experiments literally working on this right now. And if plasma physics is the answer, then there's one of our ways we can reduce it a lot. We can make our shell very thin. And then the other thing as well is that we can potentially amplify energy. And if we have access to unlimited energy through the ether, then we have all the negative energy we could possibly need. Then it's just a matter of engineering it to get the properties that we want. Now, with respect to this, some people may say, okay, well, what about conservation of momentum? Like, let's just talk the real physics. With respect to a warp bubble, we don't really have an issue of conservation of momentum, because if you put something inside a bubble, and from a perspective of the person inside the bubble, they're going to appear on the other side instantly, again, like going through a doorway. So if you were to walk through the doorway, you're going to come out on the other side the same speed you were going in. This is true for any other object we have out there. And because of that, we have no issue of conservation of momentum. But there are some physicists and engineers that I spoke to that said, no, actually, we can achieve inertial mass reduction. And if you can reduce the mass of your object, this is the idea that you can actually defy law of conservation of momentum and potentially just set something down. So the idea that someone could go through a wormhole at 100 miles an hour and they come out on the other side and they come out at a rest or at like 5 miles an hour, super slow. And that's a big difference. So this is another one of those things where it's like, it may be that the initial engineering of this technology doesn't allow for mass reduction, but potentially in the future, it can be advanced to a point where we can do stuff like that, where all of it kind of seems like magic, but it just gets even more and more and more magical. And then the other one's conservation of energy. So with respect to conservation of energy, we have to think to get around this idea of, well, energy is neither created nor destroyed. We have to think about opening our system up. So I take Pac-Man's mouth, close Pac-Man's mouth. He gets hungry. You open Pac-Man's mouth up. Now you have an open system. And now this system, you can put in a certain amount of energy to it. It can actually use energy from the environment, or from the ether, as we would call it. And then you can get more local energy out of the system. So in essence, we haven't really violated the law of conservation of energy. We've just reimagined it. Now, I would still argue that you probably have to rewrite it so that you include the ether and the unlimited negative energy into your equation, because it's kind of like cheating the system. But if our ether has unlimited negative energy, or practically unlimited, essentially an infinite amount, then that's how we can achieve some of these energy requirements and stuff like free energy that would seem otherwise impossible. So I think that's pretty much all the points in this second paper. It also goes through a lot of the images in terms of what the geometry of space-time would look like in terms of space-time being flat. And this is where you just take in this case, I'm taking a napkin or a piece of paper, and you just bend it. And you bend it, and then you puncture a hole through it. And that's the equivalent idea of a wormhole or a Stargate. And that's just if you want to be able to visualize it. Any thoughts on that, Jake?
Well, I guess I'll just say that the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, is comprised of not just governments, but also intelligence agencies and corporations that are contracted with the government, that are able to do things that the government is not able to do. And in the getting of these contracts, their employees sign NDAs, they have security clearances, they get massive checks that would incline them not to go public with this kind of information, because they don't want to disrupt their cash cow, and because the ramifications of opening their mouth or violating their NDA or their security clearance are just enormous. We're talking being locked in a prison cell for 20 years or more, possibly being executed on charges of treason, their families being ostracized and harassed, no way of ever getting a job or living a normal life. And if we look at, for example, the Manhattan Project, and how that whole thing was so compartmentalized that nobody even knew we had the atomic bomb until we had it and dropped it, and then it went public. And how it is that there was I think something like 10,000 employees in a city that the military built out in the middle of the New Mexico desert. And they worked on it for years without anybody knowing a thing that was going on. So the type of technology that we're talking about is easily compartmentalized through non-disclosure agreements, security clearances, and large checks. Also, it's important to note here that the types of technology that we are talking about would, and this is just a matter of fact, disrupt the current economy that is being used to generate all of the funds, the taxpayer money necessary to fund these government contracts, etc. So if this technology were to go public, then all of the people that are working in this economy and generating all of this money, now all that money goes out the window, because there's no economy the way that it existed before, and all of these slaves doing slave labor with minimal understanding of physics or of technology and the advancements are now privy to the secret. Also, with respect to what it is that we're talking about compartmentalization and NDAs, etc., a lot of these scientists, they don't necessarily know the totality of the big picture. They are just given a little compartmentalized piece of the puzzle that they then work on. And then people above them are the ones that put the puzzle pieces together and have this larger compartmentalized understanding of the projects or the special access programs, the black budget projects that are being worked on by these individuals that are compartmentalized. That being said, the military industrial complex has, from what I understand, advanced something like 7 to 10 years for every year that they have been around since like World War II. So if that is true, let's just say it's the low number of 7 years, and World War II was over, 80 years ago, something like that, then I'm not a math guy, what's 7 times 80? Right? Yeah. So that means we're literally hundreds of years ahead of what is on the surface. And this breakaway civilization that is literally under our feet is very, very real, and it's all compartmentalized. And the final point that I will make regarding what you were saying earlier about Stargates and people just being able to walk through them is, I don't know if you've done a lot of research into secret space program whistleblowers or what have you, but there are stories, many different stories of how it is that these individuals say go into what normally seems like on the surface a normal looking building. They get into an elevator, they slide their little key card in, they get their eye scanned, they press a button, and then the elevator takes them through a wormhole, and then lo and behold, they're on the other side of the planet. Or in some cases, some of these people have said they're like on the moon or on Mars. So this type of technology has been spoken about on several different occasions. And the final point I'd like to make is that, now some people may roll their eyes when I mention this, but looking glass technology is also something that can be factored in here, because if you understand how it is that everything is quantum entangled, and if you understand the laws of physics, then you can essentially use the types of physics that we're talking about to both peer in the past and to peer into the future through one of these bubbles and access the quantum entangled information that exists in this probability wave that is in the quantum realm. So there's a lot of testimony that corroborates what it is that you're talking about, Ashton. The thing is that a lot of people have been written off. They have been maligned. They have been just completely ignored. And people like Bob Lazar, and this is the final point that I'll make, people like Bob Lazar were one of the few courageous people that came out and started talking about this stuff. And he talked about element 115 long before we ever even knew it existed and was placed on the elemental chart.
Yeah, the sad part about Bob Lazar, if you guys watch his Joe Rogan appearances, he gets asked, like, if you could do it all over, would you do it again? And his response is no. I got to play with magical technology, got his life ruined, had nobody believed anything he was saying. And he goes, no, I wouldn't do it all again. And for the people that would say, how do you keep this stuff secret? Well, that's how, because nobody's going to believe you if you come out anyway. The people that do come out, they send all their disinformation apparatus to destroy their lives. You've probably seen that from any half a dozen or maybe even a dozen people that are out there. Anyone goes against the deep state or the elite, covert elite, or whatever you want to call them, they use all the media to go after them. They find something in their past, use it against them. It's a big information war that's out there. That's just the reality of it. For it to be kept this secret this long, that's what it would have to be. Now, I agree with Jake that the military is a breakaway civilization. I think that they've achieved that level. If you've achieved the ability to warp an object, just like a plane or some other car with some crazy superconductive harmonic orbs. But what I would say is that the technology is not an invention. So it's not that there's like a time requirement to figure it out. It doesn't take you 500 years to figure it out. You can actually catch up because it's a discovery. It's equivalent to the discovery of fire for cavemen. It's something that was always out there. You were always able to make fire. You just had to figure it out. Once you figure it out, it became trivial after that. That's the same thing with the unification theory of quantum field theory and general relativity, quantum mechanics and stuff that's macro size, very large. So how do you do this? People would ask. Well, and going back to what Jake said about SSP or what have you, or special access programs, I know the special access programs are real out there. And so we're talking about these defense contractor labs like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed, Battelle Institute, Boeing Phantom Works, SAIC. A lot of these people have got private labs, and they do contracts with these engineers, people like Bob Lazar, people that are either work independently through LLCs or they work directly for the government. So Salvatore Paez works directly for the Navy. I think Eric Davis works directly for the government as well. Like, I don't know if he's independent. People like Sean Kirkpatrick, who is the head of AARO, has his own LLC now. I'm sure he's working on these kinds of labs. I've interviewed other people that work on them as well. And they will pretty much just be open and say that, yeah, they're dealing with technology that's magic. The government goes through them so that they're protected from FOIA requests. This is how they keep it secret. And none of these people have any reason to talk about it. They don't want to risk their lives, their families' lives. They don't want to risk their money. They're getting paid a lot of money to do the stuff they do. And they get to work with magic, like Bob Lazar said. So now you understand how it's kept secret. In order to produce the effects that we need, one of the things that one of these papers actually just tells us, it says you need PetaWatt lasers that are essentially only available in these private labs. So it's not the type of situation that in order to make a gravity, like some type of the effects that we see like in the MH370 videos, we need something more than just like a household off the shelf, $20 like laser thing pointer that you're going to buy at Walmart. We need something that I'll just read it off to you guys so you can hear it directly. In a handful of labs scattered across the country, PetaWatt lasers are being built and tested. These are lasers with profound capability, able to generate short laser pulses of intensity of 10 10 to the, hold on, the thing messed up. Here it is. 10 to the 15 watts per meter squared with peak focus power densities greater than 10 to the 27 watts per meter cubed, and energy densities of 10 to the 16 joules per meter cubed. Now, why is this important is that the Schwinger limit, where space-time becomes nonlinear, which you could argue is like ripping through a hole in the fabric of reality, is potentially, I think, 10 to the 32. I think it's joules per meter cubed. I don't think it's watts. I'd have to double check. But the idea here is that we're looking at lasers that are essentially half of the requirement that we need or more in order to achieve what we think is going to break down through the fabric of reality. So these are extremely powerful lasers. And then it says, if it were possible to construct an exotic device whose energy output had W less than 1, then the calculations identical to those generate table 3, which is how much energy you need to produce a wormhole. It would seem straightforward to show that the energy density produced by an analogous dark energy laser would translate into a local expansion of space corresponding to V warp equals 10 to the minus 13 or 10 to the minus 5 meters per second, I believe, for every meter that the space that the laser travels. So basically it's saying there that we are going to create a dark energy laser. It's going to create space in front of us by shooting a laser beam. And then it says that at the end, it may be possible to construct an experiment that could measure the modified expansion of space along the length of such a laser to test the predictions of this paper. So it's basically saying we can potentially create dark energy or tap into the ether here by creating a pulse laser effect of extremely high energy densities. Maybe we shoot 2 lasers at each other and then we have them overlap, and then maybe that's how we can produce it. I'm just speculating. Now, one of these papers also mentions the idea that you can actually produce negative energy in a lab, and it's actually already been proven. So essentially what we just described right there has been proven on small scales in labs out there already. So we know we can produce essentially small amounts of negative energy. The question is, how do we produce very large amounts? And we talked about that before. Now, one of the other things that one of these papers mentions is the idea of this lensing. So if we know gravitational lensing, if I look at a black hole, it has a huge gravitational force. If there's a star behind it, what you see when you look in the night skies, you see like 4 points of light, like bending around, like in a circle formation around the black hole. We can actually see behind the black hole. And that's because it's bending space-time around it. And to such a high degree that it creates this, almost like if you take a wine glass with water on it and put it on a table and then pick it up, and you're going to see this ring there. That's essentially what we see with lensing. And the reason why this is interesting is when we look at the MH370 video, we see in the last frame, right before the wormhole, the mouth of the wormhole opens, we see the orbs flatten entirely. They're spheres, and all of a sudden they flatten. We can even see the plane bending and actually gets a little bit smaller and blurry, which is the idea of a similar lensing effect happening in the very frame right before the wormhole opens up, which is a pretty goddamn weird detail, pardon my French, to add into your hoax video if it was fake. And now this is also what I'll say. In those videos, when we see this phase transition occur in the satellite video, we see a flash. A lot of people wondered, why are we seeing a flash? Especially when we look at the drone video, we see this cold endothermic event, which is an absorption of energy. You would think if you see this absorption of energy that's kind of like a black hole, you wouldn't see a flash. Well, this second paper says this. When background light rays strike a negative energy lensing region, they are swept out of the central region, thus creating an umbra region of zero intensity. The lensing of negative energy region is not analogous to the diverging lens because in certain circumstances, it can produce more light enhancement than does the lensing of equivalent positive energy region. Which to me, if I'm interpreting that correctly, says that all the light that would hit your wormhole is going to bounce off of it like a mirror, and potentially even be amplified to some point, like a diverging lens, it says. And it can potentially produce more light enhancement than does the lensing of an equivalent positive energy region, which is basically saying that you're going to have a flash happen from that, which to me is wild when I read that, because then it brings up the idea of like, okay, especially for what I've been digging into, if the MH370 videos are fake, why are there so many details that nobody on Earth would have ever predicted in a paper from 2010, which I don't even know how many people had read it in 2014, probably not very many, and how many people less than that took it seriously. So I'm just going to say these last few things as well related to this because we're going a little bit over here. But so quantum coherence is another thing that you hear a lot in a lot of these papers. And so, I kind of look for some of the patterns in some of these papers and some of the terms they bring up. Quantum coherence is one that comes up a lot. And this is analogous to what we were talking about with having your waves cancel each other out. It's also analogous in superconductivity. When superconductivity electrons, they say, form electron pairs, Cooper pairs, and then they get this coherence. And you can imagine a coherent wave of matter or a coherent wave of electrons is essentially what superconductivity is. And quantum coherence seems to give rise to second order effects, which is like creating a new type of effect that the original would not be able to create. And one thing that we see this in is like holography, which is optical phase conjugation. This idea of turning a 2D picture into a 3D hologram. And you use optics and lasers in order to do that, actually. It's very similar to the idea of macroscopic phase conjugation. But that's just an example of something that would be a second order effect. So what is a second order effect of 2 lasers shooting each other, 2 beams of photons, concentrated photons? Maybe it's anti-gravity. Maybe it's bending space-time. I'm speculating there, but I'm trying to give you an analogy to think about. So plasma physics and semiconductors seem to be the secrets to this advanced technology. Now, I'm not telling you what to think here, but I'm just throwing some ideas out there based on what I've seen, based on what I've heard. The idea of superconductivity is extremely important. Superconductive microchips are used in like all advanced technology, including quantum computers, as well as potentially what we see in those MH370 videos. You can potentially create a wafer, which is like a microchip, right? And then have something that could produce some of these advanced effects. And I say that because there's a Lockheed Martin patent for a coherent matter wave beam, which goes back to this idea again of quantum coherence. I think that's the secret, personally, of how you produce these types of effects and how the government has produced them. And this would explain why semiconductor industries their stocks have just been going crazy, and why it's like such a highly protected industry with respect to intellectual property is that whoever has the best semiconductors, the smallest semiconductors that can produce these types of effects, you're going to have the best output. You're going to be able to do the craziest, most magical stuff. And then the last idea here is radar. So radar, we would think it's like ranging and detection, whatever. That's what radar stands for. We think of it as a passive device, but radar is used from, they use electromagnetic signals and you bounce it off your object. And phase conjugation is this idea if you bounce your electromagnetic signal off an object, like a mirror, it's going to bounce directly back in an exact opposite of what it came, which is going to potentially cancel out your wave function, which is the same thing we were trying to do when we're trying to get things in harmonic resonance. And it turns out that if you do this, as we pointed out with the Maxwell equations, is if we cancel that out, well, what do we get? We get the stress in the medium. So then it opens up all of a sudden this idea that radar, when used with phase conjugation, can produce scalar potentials. So you could imagine this idea of creating a scalar beam that you can shoot. And Thomas Bearden in the 80s promoted this idea that, well, it looks like there's nothing there because you've canceled out your wave functions perfectly from an electromagnetic perspective, but the stress is still there. And if we then take two of those beams and we cross them, we can create an interference zone where you have constructive and destructive interference. And this is how you can either produce energy at a distance or you can potentially remove energy at a distance, a cold explosion. And so this is, I think, opens the door to scalar physics, the unification of quantum mechanics, as well as macroscopic effects, and tapping in to that ether, because the only way that we can produce these types of scalar beams is the idea that our wave is propagating through a medium that we don't perceive, which is potentially the ether. And what that means is going from a transverse wave, imagine like a sine wave or an ocean wave, to a situation where it becomes like a sound wave, a longitudinal wave through the ether. And so this is kind of how we unify a lot of these concepts and potentially the exact types of technology to create this stuff. So the last thing I would have you remember and think is like what Eric Hecker said on the Sean Ryan shows, that people need to learn the idea of directed energy weapons, because radar is not simply a passive device. Electromagnetic, anything that can transmit electromagnetic signals can potentially be used as a weapon, which I think is kind of a mind-blowing thing, at least for me. There you go, Jake. Whew.
Well,
Grab another beer.
I want to start by saying that the human body, the electromagnetic field of the body, actually emits scalar waves, and they affect the longitudinal lines of the Earth. So this is intimately connected into what you're talking about like scalar waves and scalar energy affecting longitudinal lines of the universe. And if the longitudinal lines of the universe and the Earth are intimately connected also with our bodies, then this may be how it is that from a physics standpoint, we are able to traverse wormholes and move throughout space and time in that regard, because we are intimately connected to the very fabric of the universe itself. Now, that being said, I think it's also important to mention, based on what you were saying earlier about there being no event horizon and the flash of light that came out of or off of the wormhole that was created in that video of the MH370, are you familiar with tensor networks?
Not really, but stress tensor is definitely one of the physics concepts I want to get a better idea on, because I do think it's related to this idea of stress in the medium.
Well, tensor networks, from what I understand, are basically how it is that the universe is quantum entangled, and how it is that we can have multiple different realities that are kind of based off of a similar frequency. But if and when the quantum entangled frequency of certain particles changes enough, then you can end up getting like a bifurcation or like a splitting of the bubble of the tensor network, and you can get dualistic realities that kind of overlap one another, or at least are tangentially connected to one another, and basically like the creation of a universe that is like a quantum entangled version, like the positive and negative charges for like what would be normally quantum particles and how they are quantum entangled, but also like that on a macro scale. So this is how it could involve like the creation of different universes within the multiverse. And in order for something like a wormhole to be traversed or even created, you would have to intimately understand things like tensor networks and how it relates to quantum entanglement, so that you could move something from one place to another within that tensor network without moving to another version of reality itself, or another version of the universe.
I wanted to add something real quick in there too, which is that the brain, you have your left and right hemisphere as well. Is that I've seen some arguments that that's, you know, an scalar interferometry network itself. You know, both if you imagine like consciousness like interacting with reality, which I think is pretty cool. Just because we are running a little short on time, do you want to pull some people up and then we can have them ask questions and you can kind of opine a little bit more or whatever?
Absolutely.
Cool.
I'm going to bring Holo Cypher up real quick because this dude blew my mind, and I would love to hear him and you converse a little bit, and then we'll get to some other people.
Okay, yeah, I'm on my desktop, so like my thing's all kind of buggy. I don't know who's up or not, so I'll let you
Holo
take care of pulling
Cypher,
people up.
go ahead, brother, if you have something you'd like to say or questions you'd like to ask. Maybe I surprised him. He's not unmuting his mic. Holo Cypher, are you there, sir? Okay, well, then we will go to somebody else until he is able to get to his mic. I think I saw DeQuan has been there waiting patiently. I don't know where Source just went, but I was going to bring him up. A part of one, and let's see. Love of Humanity has been waiting a while. Prometheus has been waiting. AJ, I got you. Where did Holoseph
Yeah, if anyone
go?
else
There he
wants to
is.
ask questions or just, you know, talk about
Yeah,
it.
let's try to keep it to questions.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, good call.
Yeah, because then, you know, we'll go way too long. Holo Cypher, can you hear now?
Yeah, I don't know. That was weird. You brought me up and it just cached out my network connection. So hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, sir. Feel free to speak, ask questions. Holo Cypher, this is Ashton Holo Cypher. Ashton,
Yo.
I'll just tell you, Holo Cypher blew my mind into space, and ever since then I really like hearing what he has to say.
I like how his @ is Fractal Universe, so or Fractal Verse.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
Well, there's good reason for that, isn't there? I mean, the further you dig into this, the further you start to see that there's a whether it's from a cosmological sort of standpoint, that you see fractal displacement through the clustering configuration of the local star cluster. We see that there's Batner and Callisto came up with the egg carton network theory, which isn't much of an egg carton. It's more of an octahedral lattice structure, which I guess is a good way to enter into all this, right? But there's also fractal, just to finish that off, fractal verse, fractality, fractal nested networks within the brain itself, within the microtubulins and within our blood-brain barrier. And everything is essentially, we have crystals on the inside of our skull, for example, tuned very specifically to the resonance of the planet. And so we have a fractal identity on the micro and the macro scale. And obviously our job right now is to pull those two ends of the pool together so they can talk. And so I've made some notes over everything you guys have said. You kind of, where I chimed in and started listening to you guys, you were talking about the vector equilibrium, which had to do with, I don't know how much I missed before that, but of course, like having read through all Buckminster Fuller's material, I could definitely say a few things on that because my starting point, other than, perhaps a lot of people had read, Graham Hancock and got their feathers wet a bit there and got kind of more curious as to how this technology was clearly utilized in ancient past times. And when you kind of start pulling on that, you see there's a sacred geometry principle behind that. And now we're sort of getting back to that with respect to kind of how to implement that on different levels of technology. So I think what's interesting too is that the vector equilibrium, it's for me kind of special because I have to, my job is to kind of bring out the temporal topology or temporal mechanics and just explain this last sort of vestige of physics where for example Lee Smolden, he had discussed in several of his books really that the critical component that we seem, at least from his point, to be missing out on is time. So what does time have to do with the vector equilibrium? Well, isn't this interesting? When you take into Buckminster Fuller's system accounting, which was always done with the tetrahedron. Tetrahedron was essentially like his bottom, like his penny, if you will. And in terms of volumetrics, it takes 20 of these tetrahedral pennies to account for a vector equilibrium. Well, isn't that interesting? Because we have several ancient calendrical systems, not just calendrical systems, but what's integrated into some of the actual social political integration, such as in ancient Norway, they used the vigesimal system, but also in Sumeria and in the Maya, all three of the Maya calendars all used vigesimal as its base counting. Obviously, they had individual days, but the 20-day was quintessential for time count for whatever reason. And so when we're looking at quantum topology as, say, vector equilibrium, or as Buckminster Fuller, he thought it was so important. Okay, first of all, I should briefly outline quickly that the vector equilibrium is something that Bucky thought was capable of being at the heart of all the topology. So if you started with the tetrahedron, you can kind of truncate that down in half, what he called wavelength or edge elements. So you can truncate a star tetrahedron becomes an octahedron. An octahedron then becomes a cubo-octahedron. And through this well, this is having to do with stillation and truncation of topologies. And through that process, we can actually discover more inner nested features. So while you guys are looking at Jake's description of self-nested cubo-octahedron or vector equilibrium, so Bucky gave it that special name. He actually kind of put it up on the pedestal of saying it needs a new name because of how you replace the meeting points of those edges with sphere centers, and you start to see the spherical representation of this, which gets us into a lot of how biology nests itself and so forth. So there's an interesting interaction that I want to get to, though. I don't want to stay hung up on sacred geometry too long, but for those of you interested, certainly there's lots of material with there's a book written about Bucky's work. It's much easier and much more approachable than Synergistics. It's called Everything I Know by Amy C. Edmondson. It's a great book to get your beak wet on that. Moving forward, though, trying to connect more so than just quantum topology with time, but actually getting to some of, like, for example, I'm going to jump a bit around here, but I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and we've got to get to, of course, wormholes and natural wormholes that are going to be taking place in this next few days, which is what they readily admit are called electron diffusion regions, or EDRs. This work is being done mostly by University of Iowa, and he discusses this is where the entanglement of the solar wind meets with the geomagnetic filaments, if you will. So we got filaments from the sun and we got filaments on around the Earth, and it's when those connect that we have moments to observe. And we have satellite cluster configurations that can do real volumetric analysis, so they can give us a breakdown of how these events happen. They're very brief, but they give us a glimpse as to natural wormholes and how they work. Of course, as Ashton was saying, to open up a sizable wormhole, as the standard physics will tell you, takes the energy mass equivalent of Jupiter, which only denotes how disparagingly remote current physics is to approaching this, but it still gives you an idea of the sort of leverage that you need to have. But if we get over to what Hal Puthoff was saying with Eric Weinstein on American Alchemy, he discusses, for example, there being enough energy within a glass of water to essentially boil off the entire oceans. We've heard this probably from several others as well, but this gives us an idea of how a potential amount of energy is available in a given amount of volume. And that if it just takes a little bit of rejigging with our physics to get there, things that we're seeing that seem magical, they seem beyond our approach, other than maybe through a sci-fi lens, become a lot more approachable, as does traveling superluminal, et cetera, et cetera. So we have very good examples that did appear in the public for a very brief period of time, such as Yevgeny Pukletnov in the mid-90s. He came out with several papers addressing gravity impulse capabilities. And that, in that case, was a superconductor of kind of like a ringette ring, if you will, that was made out of basically a type 2 superconductor. And they had noticed that it was shielding about 3% of gravity at that time because they were smoking in the lab, and no, they weren't supposed to, but the smoke was being attracted above their superconductor, and they got to measuring weights above it. And of course they found, yes, indeed, not just in that floor, in that room, they noticed every floor above them impeded not by matter, that there was a 3% mass reduction. And that's literally the only real example we have of mass reduction in the sort of public purview. And as per, there's several papers written on it. We found out through later studies that early 2000s, he published some papers that showed that gravity potentially was traveling at 64 times the speed of light, which may denote the frequency of gravity has an ability to travel at different velocities, or factors of the speed of light. And so this gets us into sort of T. Townsend Brown, which we found out from another American Alchemy interview, that T. Townsend Brown in later stages of his life was very interested in this thing called sidereal radiation, which gets to how planetary frequencies are affecting potentially gravity, which is also dovetailing into Rupert Sheldrake's work, where he discusses the big G changing as if it was like the stock market, and how metrology people in the UK had standardized and fixed it to the speed of light. So, or to the second, as a SI interval of imperial standard of measurement, so that they would fix that and not take note of the fact of what was changing that. That's where the critical intersection lies. Now, I just want to touch on quantum coherence real quick, because obviously the declassified work of Dr. Hobo Grinberg Silverbaum from the 90s, we found his papers released in the early 2000s from the CIA reading room, which showed coherent states, which are obviously quantum in the brain, which we know from the work of whether it's Sarfati and Bohm with the Bohmian theory, or Penrose and Hameroff with the OR theory. So there's plenty of theories to go around, but the fact is, it's the quantum coherent state that actually has this, which he called synturgic theory, which has the ability to essentially take neuronal fields or neurological fields that are around the head and around your body, and through coherent states interact with the space-time metric, which gets back to what Puthoff was saying with Weinstein, that they could engineer and alter mu and nu, these factors of altering the space-time metric, the permittivity and permeability, they said was engineerable. Like, holy shit, people. Like, that's crazy that we're actually broaching these topics that were always fairly classified. So it's like, slowly but surely, if we keep pulling on the string, I swear to God, if we could get Hal Puthoff into space and we could actually ask him I'm sure between the three of us, man, we could really go to town with this guy. But is he ever going to get cleared for a conversation with the public? I don't know, but I don't want to ramble too much on. Yeah, you're on this
question. I've asked, and apparently he doesn't have any will to want to do it.
Oh, come on.
Speaks to the idea though of a lot of these engineers that are in the know, that are part of these labs, they don't have any. There's no cost benefit for them to go do that. They don't want to be famous. They're not trying to be a celebrity. They're getting paid maybe even millions of dollars. They're well endowed. They don't want, their families to be at risk. Whoa. Okay, hold on.
Whoa. Whoever unmuted themselves, do not do that again. So by all means, go ahead, Ashton.
Thank you. So then the other things I want to say, Holocipher, you had some really good points there. I think especially near the end where you were talking about the Puthoff, Weinstein, Jesse Michaels interview. I've spoken to Jesse Michaels a few times myself, actually. And he's pretty skeptical about the stuff that I put forth related to some of this, but he's open-minded about it. I think he's an incredibly smart guy. And I think that it's because one of the aspects, if you want to learn this, a good skill to have is to be a student of history. And that's one of the things I think Jake is really good at, because he knows history really well. And Jesse Michaels was a history major, I believe, as well. Because it turns out that all this stuff, we don't have to discover new science. The science is all out there. That's the saddest part. You just have to do a history lesson and look into it. So you were mentioning, I think Potklinov as well, who worked with superconductors. Superconductors, again, it's just a perfectly conductive semiconductor. This is why I talk about the idea of semiconductors are one of the main aspects to make this technology work. And a lot of these anti-gravity scientists were working with superconductors. So Potklinov was doing it. Ning Li, which I posted about and people talk about a lot. You know, she quote unquote disappeared, but really the rumor is she just like went into DoD contracting for private labs, including like Lockheed Martin. And that's what they do. They just suck you in. I know that because people have just told me directly. And then Amy Eskridge is one of the more recent ones where she passed away a couple of years ago. The official story is that she committed suicide, just in case people want to know. And even if she did, you can imagine, like, if you know this technology is real, they have to have staff psychologists on hand. Because imagine you go and you're working on like straight up anti-gravity, and then you got to jump in your gas-powered car when you know we could be living in a world of zero pollution, free energy for everybody, and you got to go fill up and pay $5 a gallon for gas in your completely obsolete car. Like, imagine what that does to your psyche. And then if you come out and tell anybody, they're just going to think you're nuts. Like, that's just gotta mess people up. So Amy is with us in spirit right now. I know that. I just feel that. She's somebody that wanted Tucker Carlson to know about this. The clip I may post again later where she says like Tucker Carlson would be the guy to bring this forward. And I think he is, because he talked to Jake. Jake talked about the Salvatore Pais patents. I think Tucker's interested in this UFOlogy and what it means. So I hope that one day we can bring this information to him and get it to a huge audience. I think that's all I wanted to say. Thanks a lot, Holocypher. Great comments, man.
Yes, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
All right. Since we're kind of running low on time here, we're gonna try to hop around as fast as we can. I think that somebody that's been waiting a long time was God's Source, or
I needed a little bit of break there.
Sauce.
So I was happy to let him chat.
And we'll go to Love Humanity after that.
You want me to post a clip of what we just said right there?
Source, that's you, man.
I can probably do that later.
Okay.
Check.
There we go. Okay. Go ahead. I was waiting for you to open your mic. We couldn't hear you. He dropped down. I'll try to bring him back up.
Tucker
Next,
Carlson
we will
clip?
go
Yeah,
to...
I'll take a snip to Tucker Carlson clip later.
I think it was... actually, no. We're going to go to a part of one, and then we'll go over to Love Humanity.
How y'all doing? I want to not clarify, but give some importance on what I was talking about the Earth having like this electrical magnetic field that is influencing the body, and basically this crystals in our brain is called magnetite crystals, and every animal on the planet that's uses the magnetite crystals to navigate the weather and where to go when it gets cold, when the season changes. And we as humans, we not trained or or studied this type of information on a regular basis. So I feel like if we try to understand this more often and understand how intimately connected that our body is with the universe, these technologies that y'all discuss will be more accessible to the world.
Roger that. I agree. Let's try to go over to Love Humanity. If we can try to keep this to questions, you guys, we're really running low on time. And while we have Ashton here and his knowledge available, I think it would be really good for us to use this prime opportunity to get some clarification on the things that we've discussed in this space. So go ahead, Love Humanity. Okay, we're not going there. Sorry about that. Your mic's all funky, so removing you from speaker. Sorry. All right, so let's go to God's Source again.
Hey, how's it going? Wonderful space. Nice to meet you, Ashton. Trusting this new era of big S institutionalized science, when basically knowing what we do about quantum collapse, quantum function collapse, just the basic stuff would tell you that you really need to trust your own eyes and not instrumentation that has to be converted into binary and given back to you, because it's going to show you what if this if this is a simulation or whatever, it's going to show you what that would be, but not maybe what it is, or maybe not what it potentially could be if you didn't even look. And so yeah, the idea of like us sending out satellites that are looking, potentially billions of miles off into the yonder and collapsing those probabilistic places that, maybe there's nice cultures of who knows what existing in those probabilities, and we're collapsing them all. I don't know. Can we even trust that that's legitimate, or is it just something that might be pulling the wool over our eyes?
How do we get into this one?
If this was a simulation, could we trust our instrumentation, or is it basically, is that not within our reach? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one to answer in terms of if our reality is holographic principle, where does the magic end and where does the the foundation basis for science begin? That's certainly one thing that I am careful about. I want to say is that I try, even though we may have stuff that seems like magic. Okay, well, what does that mean? There's still got to be limitations out there. It doesn't mean that every possible thing is magic. There's still got to be some foundation for it. So this is where I'd like to talk about trying to build up from a scientific standard to these ideas that are bigger and bigger questions. Now, I think the other thing you said, what was it? Related to what can we trust that's out there? Again, I think that we have to use the scientific method, and the old scientific method is science is the study of observable reality. So this is the thing too that I think a lot of science gets wrong, where it's
let me be specific.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ashton, and then we'll go back to you, Source. I just want Ashton to finish his thought, please.
Yep. So I was just going to say science is the study of observable reality. And a lot of science would say that, okay, your science is built up based on scientific papers or what have you. But people forget that, no, science is actually what we see and observe. And then the papers are us trying to explain what we see and observe. Go ahead.
Yeah. I completely agree with the methodological aspect. I was kind of wondering why certain Nikon cameras that are now discontinued and only being used by NASA seem to show a perfectly magnified version of what the eye sees versus a digitally reconstructed. Is that really what we're looking at? It's almost like your DSLR camera or whatever kind of digital binary telescope is reconstructing this image in a way that is completely different than how the eye sees it in this place. And it's like I was trying to look for these cameras and they're all discontinued now. I have to find a used one. And I just started thinking, like, what is the difference physically? Like what are they doing that doesn't collapse the wave function?
Are you asking that based on the notion that digital cameras or telescopes in general are actually absorbing far more information than the human eye, and that because of that, what we're getting back must be in some way, shape, or form kind of doctored so that we could see it as we would like to see it versus as it actually is? Is that what you're getting at?
I have a very good visual acuity, and I've watched the stars for so long. And when someone shows me the weird Nikon image of the dancing cymatic sphere, it's like, yes, that's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm seeing up there. And it boggles my mind. And then when someone else is like, no, here's what you're looking at, this is from NASA, it's like, bullshit. And they're discontinuing them for commercial use, but they're keeping them for themselves. And it's like something's happening here. And I think it's like, I don't think they have to doctor every image. I think it's built into the simulation.
Yeah, well, I think Ashton and likely Holo Cypher would agree with me when I say we know NASA is not telling us everything that there is to know. They are and have been a Nazi front for a long time. Werner von Braun was a Nazi, a paperclip Nazi. So there's a lot that we're not being told. I think NASA is also kind of like a money laundering machine for special access programs and the secret space programs. So, Ashton, did you have anything you wanted to say on that before I move on to somebody else?
No, it's not really my area of expertise, but I will say that NASA is definitely not a straight answer. So yeah, don't trust a single damn thing NASA says.
Totally. All right. Let's go to I think we had AJ Media has been waiting a while. We'll also go to AJ. Holo Cypher, I'm going to come back to you. I'll let you have the last question, just because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of things that you can go into or hear, and we'll have comment on. Then after that, we will go to Prometheus. So it's going to go AJ Media, AJ, Prometheus. Then we're going to go over to Soul, and then 33. A part of one is if you can make it brief, then cool. We'll come back to you, and then Holo Cypher, and then Ashton will wrap it up. Oh, and don't take it personally if and when you're done with your question, I'm going to drop you guys down.
Oh yeah, so in terms of the radar system, so you talk about how the radar systems are what produce the scalar potential via phase conjugation, and that they're not just basically detection systems. Is there some references of things you could look at to look at the specs of how these radar systems work if you kind of want to learn more about the technology of that? And then also a couple other things. You mentioned that you had submitted to the AARO the names of a couple folks, including Joseph Dunford with Lockheed Martin. Can you talk about that? Because it seems like there were direct connections with these agencies that did testify to their knowledge that these videos are real, the technology is real. And then just lastly, if you're kind of doing kind of your own independent research, trying to assist with the case, what do you think is the next thing that should be done in terms of looking at just solutions? What can be done? Like say you're trying to do your own independent research, trying to assist with the case to, try to get this information more known, or try to get responses from some of these, government agencies and such.
Yeah, great questions. Let's start with the last one so I can keep them all in my head here. If you want to help out, I think just bringing awareness is the best thing. And I know that doesn't seem very proactive, but it's really the problem we face is one of conscious awareness and waking people up. And when we reach a certain level of consciousness, I think that the truth will become self-evident out there. Harassing people isn't really going to get us there. Trying to force people to believe the stuff's not going to get us there. I have it now on really good authority that the videos are real, and that people that are very prominent have seen it and are talking about them in ways that they're taking it seriously. And they're saying a lot of the same stuff that we're saying here from a physics perspective as well as the stuff that Thomas Bearden had mentioned as well, and even other stuff as well, which is honestly just blows my mind. But, Joseph Dunford is one where I've told the story many times, where supposedly his nephew was shown the videos, and somebody who's friends with the nephew told me about it. And the whole thing seemed very credible. There was no gotcha at the end. They never came out and were like, I lied to this guy. He literally begged me to delete the post about it because I showed the screenshots of the communications, and that person had to delete all their social media after that. So it was pretty damn bizarre. And they begged me to delete the post, which I ended up doing. And then I ended up reposting it later on with removing all the social media tags of the person. So and Joseph Dunford would have been the guy who potentially would have been in charge of the mission. And he got promoted to the highest ranked military officer afterwards in the entire United States, like literally the advisor to the president, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense for 4 years under both Obama and Trump. And then he retired in 2019 and became board of directors on Lockheed Martin. And this is a good plug for what just began, which we'll go to after this, is the my interview with Ian Carroll just started. We recorded it a little while ago. And in there, he pulls up the board of directors, Lockheed Martin. He's like, I heard you talking about this guy. And he goes to Joseph Dunford. And it turns out that he's on some special committee within the board of directors at Lockheed Martin as well. And there's a bunch of ex-military generals and stuff that are on their board of directors. So extremely sketchy in terms of the fact that this guy gets this huge promotion. He's also the one that started Space Force for President Trump. So if there's somebody hiding secrets, guys, Joseph Dunford is the guy. And he's a guy who I didn't even know who he was before this person drops his name to me. So yeah, I think that answers your questions. Yeah, so I think that they know about it, and the question is like, holy shit, like how long are they hiding this, and how many people know? So anyway, hopefully that answers your questions, man. Good questions.
All right, we're going to AJ. Let's try to make it fast. So, because I know Ashton probably wants to get in the chat that he was of the video they using with Ian.
You got it, Jake. I just wanted to ask the hosts, what's your opinion on Deja Vu? Because like in the movie The Matrix, the guy sees the cat cross his path twice, and they say it's just a glitch in the Matrix. I wonder if that's more than just an allegory. Like, does it have to do with alternate realities, or or is it just our brain playing a trick on us? I know it's a different topic, but I've been waiting to ask since you were talking about alternate universes about 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, and I'll go real quick on mine, and then Jake can take it, because I don't think that the ether represents an alternate universe, but that doesn't rule it out. If you listen to my interview I did with Tom Montauk, guy's a genius, and one of the things he brought is up this idea of like time loops, and you can imagine a closed time loop, like the TV show Dark, or like the movie Tenet, where whatever happened always happened. But you could also imagine, what if there's multiple loops, and every person has different loops, and those loops are constantly interacting? That could create this idea of alternate timelines. And it definitely comes up with respect of superluminal travel, faster than light speed, because it does beg the question, like, okay, we know time dilation is real. We can travel to the future, but can we travel to the past? Like, can we teleport from Mars to Earth and then look up and see ourselves waving at ourselves? Pretty weird concepts to think about.
For me personally, Deja Vu has been instrumental in my life. I have had numerous deja vus where I have had visions of the future that later came into fruition and came to be a reality. And in many cases, there was very specific messages and information that were almost encoded into the deja vu, that if like I had this deja vu at this time, then that meant X, Y, and Z. And if I do an act on X, Y, and Z, then I can do an act on A, B, and C and affect the timeline. So in shamanism, visions of the future, or deja vu, what have you, dreamscape, and in the dream world, they all kind of interlace and interweave together to create a larger view of space-time. So with that said, let us not forget that everything is made up of energy. And that includes our consciousness. Our consciousness is essentially this, what quantum physicists call non-local consciousness. It is the signal of self-awareness that permeates all creation and impregnates all of matter with some form of life. This also plays into shamanism and the notion of animism. So if consciousness is essentially, or mind is creating reality, then if we have the ability to create vehicles that can traverse space-time, then we can also use consciousness to do the same thing. And when it comes to deja vu or visions of the future, I would have you look into tachyons and the fact that tachyons travel so fast through what we consider space and time, they basically travel backward through space and time from the future to the past, as opposed to, things moving from the past to the future. So if there are other quantum particles, not just tachyons, which there are, I just can't remember the name of them, that travel backward through space and time, then they are encoded with information. This is how and why it is that you are able to, if you're thirsty, get up from your chair, walk across the room, and grab yourself some water. Because in your mind, you saw that future of you getting up, moving your three-dimensional body through the fourth dimension of time to this fifth dimensional probability that exists within the larger probability wave of space-time. So that means that if you expand your consciousness to these higher harmonic vibrations, to these higher octaves of self-awareness beyond the physical, then you can essentially tap into this extra dimension that we're talking about being tapped into through technology. And you can essentially travel through space-time. You can skip across the dimension of time the way that we talked about earlier these vehicles are doing. You can skip across these dimensions of time the way that a rock skips across water, and you can end up perceiving information from the future and then act on it. So I think that deja vu is similar to that. I also personally think that it is evidence that we're on the right track mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically. And that being said, I think that when we understand that the stuff that we're talking about achieving technologically through craft or the understanding the laws of physics are also able to be done with our consciousness field, because as I said earlier, the human body emits scalar waves and they affect the longitudinal lines of the earth. And if everything is quantum entangled, then that means the scalar waves emitting off of our body and affecting the longitudinal lines of the earth also affect the longitudinal lines of the universe itself. And if you look into things like the doorway of the gods in Peru, and the way that shamans have been using that to literally traverse the cosmos for millennia. And I actually know a story of this. I talked to this guy that knew the shaman in Peru that taught him basically the key to journeying through this wormhole or this Stargate, the song or the words that he had to say. And his wife, the guy walked up to the doorway of the gods. He said the magic words and sang the magic song. And lo and behold, his wife saw him dematerialize in front of her eyes. And then he said he was like going down this light tunnel, and all around him were all these other light tunnels. And then he wound up in this room, this white room filled with light, with these massive light beings that basically said, "What are you doing here? Why? What are you doing? How, you're like a child wandering around. You're really, really lucky that we found you, because you might not be able to get back. So we're going to send you back. We're going to send your ass back to where you came from, and don't do this again." And so then his wife saw him within a minute or two rematerialize. And for him, it lasted way longer than a minute or two, rematerialize in front of her. And he was messed up, just totally fucked up for like 3 to 6 months because of this experience. So understanding this notion of natural stargates, natural vortexes, natural wormholes, how it is that they intricately weave within space-time, understanding the human body and how it is a part of this interwoven pattern, this tapestry of the cosmos, and then fathoming the totality of that big picture, and then taking that understanding and then creating a craft that's able to do it. You have two ways then. You can do it through technology, or you can do it through using the physical body as a technology and the electromagnetic field around it to gain access to future or past events. And that comes into like looking glass technology and stuff. So you have the ability to do so with technology. You can look in the future of the past, or you can do so with your consciousness and look into the future of the past. Let's go over to Prometheus.
Wow, my brain is just expanded to light years across right now. Thanks so much, Jake, Ashton. Amazing conversation. Ashton, I wanted to ask you about quantum computing, and I tagged you guys on a post. So I work in the field of technology, and recently there has been some breakthroughs in terms of creating wormholes, supposedly using quantum computing technology. So I wanted to know, Ashton, if that's something that you'd explored yourself, and yeah, like if what do you see in terms of like wormhole creation and information exchange when it comes to quantum computing and technology?
There we go. Yeah, so from respect to the quantum computing, there's something where it always feels like there's something there where they're not really telling us. I mean, we've had these quantum computers for like 30 years in the late 90s, and like conventional media would say, well, we don't really know what to do with it, which is just really weird to me. Like, well, why do we develop it? It must have developed it for some reason. I would speculate that we have the military developed it for some purpose that we don't really utilize it for in the public perspective yet. Maybe something really powerful. One of the things that it's been proposed to do is like develop new metamaterials, which I think is another way where we can increase our material science and thus technologically evolve significantly. The letter to Ashton Forbes also mentioned this idea of that we've had this technology for a long time in terms of like, you know, teleporting an object, warping an object. But that quantum computers in the early 2000s were when it really started to take off. Where we really started to be able to do magic with it because we were no longer limited by human limitations like reaction time and things like that. And I think that's a really interesting concept because if you look at the papers that we talked about, they came out in 2010. If you imagine that that was people writing up science they already knew was real from the black projects in the black world, then that could line up with the idea of us first having like really had this technology become Star Trek level in like the early 2000s. So that's my thoughts on that.
Just to let you know, Prometheus, I just did a live on quantum computing and how that works and how it is that the brain is a quantum computer. I placed it up in the nest. So check that out if and when you have the time. It's only like an hour and 13 minutes if you're so inclined.
Would love to, bro. That's awesome.
Alrighty, let's go to, I believe I said Soul. SOL, Soul, if that's how you pronounce it. It's got the emoji of the sun in there, giving you an opportunity to speak here, amigo. Okay, moving on. 33.
Hello. Good, great space tonight, guys. 33 from the Naughty Conspiracy Chat. Ashton, I believe the question might have been proposed at the start is where did the microchips like come from? And there's a little theory I had, and I'd like to back it off you. We went back to the Roswell incident and the technology way back then, but for the microchips, the ships. Do you think that a hadron collider could speed up a particle fast enough to be able to shoot it down? Like the conspiracy is that alien space crafts and technology crashed in the Roswell Desert, and that's where we gained the technology from. My question proposes, do you think the technology existed for us to shoot them down? Because as we know, with rockets and technology that we currently use in the military, we would not be able to hit anti-gravity machine that is moving at proportional speed. So yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think the US has a US? Yeah.
Good question. Yes, because the question is like, really, if you could create a space-time bubble, you can create like a force field, essentially. I mean, that's kind of what it is. So could anything even get through if you can create some type of gravitational manipulation, like a white hole, the opposite of a black hole? And I would agree, conventional weapons would be of no effect against that type of technology. But actually, I think it's a little bit simpler than that. Is that just because something seems very advanced does not mean it's invincible. Even Superman has a weakness, which is kryptonite. So in this case, what's the weakness to anti-gravity? If anti-gravity is based on electromagnetism, well, how do we produce a scalar potential? We use scalar beams and we interfere them. So what if we shoot our radar at a UFO? What is that going to do to it? Imagine like it's the equivalent of essentially taking a surfer and pushing them off balance, or taking somebody who's riding a bike and hitting their handlebars. Now, all of a sudden, your craft is going to lose its stability that it had before. I personally believe that we used radar to knock down UFOs that we've taken down. That we're not using rockets and missiles to knock them down. That would generally be ineffective. We might have accidentally caused craft to fall because we didn't even realize the capabilities of radar at the time. This is why I harp on radar so much. Radar is potentially a directed energy weapon, as well as capability to take down something that's using electrogravitic effects. So that becomes the next battlefield in terms of the Cold War, the technological advancement happening behind the scenes.
Good answer.
Sure.
All right, let's go over to Soul. This is your last chance before I drop you, amigo. All righty. A part of one, try to make it fast.
Okay. What is your thoughts on brain heart coherence in the 40,000 specialized cells called sensory neurites and within the brain? What are the correlations with that and the electrical magnetic frequencies of the universe?
Jake, I'll probably let you take that one. I don't really have any. I don't really know in general. I mean, when it comes to a lot of the esoteric stuff or like the neurological stuff, like to me, it's not really necessarily my wheelhouse. I do think that there potentially is this idea of like using scalar weapons to damage people's brains. I think Gary Nolan has looked into a lot of that. People who are like too close or too exposed to either some of these craft that use these effects. All I know is that if there is some kind of hovering object, I'm not standing underneath it, staying far away from it, because it could be giving off some kind of crazy radiation.
I'll just say that the heart-brain coherence is how it is that we create reality. The human body is a standing wave of energy. The electromagnetic field around the body is a standing wave of energy, and it is based on harmonics and therefore mathematics. What you want to do is harmonize all of the chakras. You want to harmonize the waveforms coming out of the brain and the heart, and the heart is actually more powerful than the brain as far as electromagnetics is concerned. And there are actually neurons inside the heart, believe it or not, that kind of tell the brain what to do. For the longest time, we thought it was the brain telling the heart, but no, actually, it's the heart telling the brain. So if you look into Greg Braden's The Lost Mode of Prayer, he talks about how it is to create a coherent pattern that ends up affecting the quantum realm by combining an emotion and a thought of the same frequency, and then creating a feeling in the heart space that ends up informing the quantum realm as to the reality that you wish to branch to in space and time. That being said, we are intimately connected to the universe, and the universe is comprised of numerous different harmonic standing waves of energy. Part of the role of these directed energy weapons, or things like psychotronic weaponry or whatever, is to, and all, as well as all the propaganda that's out there, is to create decoherence within the human electromagnetic field in the human brain and the body, so that your heart and your mind are not creating a similar waveform, so that you don't create the reality that you desire, but instead you observe reality the way that you're told. And if you are not buying the propaganda that is being shoved down your throat, then that's where things like psychotronic weaponry comes into play, and how they can manipulate the neural connectivity in your brain, and even do things like muscle twitches, affect your dreams, all sorts of stuff, because the human electromagnetic field is intimately connected to the physical body. I think that pretty much answers the question. I'm not trying to go too long here. So, Holo Cypher, if you can, let's try to wrap it up, make it fast. We're going to give Ashton the last word here.
Yeah, I think there's just a couple of things to tie in here, including perhaps a note that we should probably make on incoming solar weather, having to do with, another driver towards our quantum cortical coherent interface, often what they call a cortical coherent interface. This has to do with the brain-heart connection, and how basically through modulating of the same, we can alter not only our perception, but our interaction with our local and surrounding space-time. But this also modulates not just local space-time, but the potential for these non-local entangled, which I refer to as the entanglement coefficient, is changing as the solar activity changes. So just like Hal Puthoff was saying that we could potentially engineer the space-time metric, what's happening, to give you a more down-to-earth kind of example of this, is what's happening right now with the ionosphere, otherwise called the Schumann resonant cavity. This is changing with the solar plasma coming into the ionosphere. It changes both the Q value, which is essentially a fancy word for denoting the quality of the resonator. This changes the conductivity and permittivity of essentially ionosphere, which changes the way that even if the frequencies didn't change, it would change its intensity. But in actual fact, the ionosphere shifts, and because of that, it shifts the base frequency. And the way they calculate it is pretty simple. You just take the circumference, at least in terms of the mathematical backbone to this. It's just the circumference of Earth, which, I'm sorry, we have to use metric.
Okay, I'm going to quiet that because I want to close up as fast as I can do it here, which is I've got the Ian interview is live right now on X. It's also live on Rumble. For some reason, it's not up on YouTube. So you can watch on Rumble. Please follow Ian Carroll on Rumble, on YouTube. And I just retweeted right now the link to the X version of it where I'm live in the chat with them on X. Hopefully it's working correctly. So you can watch that right now. There's 17,000 people watching it at the moment. It's about 20 minutes in. You can either start over and watch, or you can watch us live on X. So yeah, I am live right now with Ian. It's a pre-recorded interview, but I'm in the chat, and I'm gonna drop after this, after we finish this space, and then I'm gonna jump into the chat there, and I'm gonna watch it, and I'll interact with people in the chat on the stream. So I posted a link. I'll post another link for you guys. Here's the link. This guy's too long-winded. Why is the chat not working? The chat gets stuck. Sucks. Give me a sec. I'm gonna
basically, there's one little interesting thing that ties this together with our DNA, which is the work of Luc.
You can go to my
Dr. Luc Montagnier. He was a Nobel Prize winner for his work on
I'll say it one more time after
essentially
we're done with
virology, but more so having to do with AIDS. But later on, his work became very controversial because he started using Schumann frequencies to essentially teleport DNA expression
I'm in too many dimensions
through
at once.
essentially the internet, using the 7 hertz as the modulated or
I don't know
incubation
anything about Schumann
sort of
frequencies,
frequency. So we have the idea that DNA is integrated into Schumann at a fundamental resonant level. And if that's the case, then any small changes, as Dr. Persinger has already pointed out, and many others, including decades of Russian research, have shown that small changes in the Schumann could create very small changes within genomic expression, which then unfolds into a whole different type of expression. It doesn't take a lot
dropping
to
off
create
this
a big
space.
effect
I might
in this
have
way.
to
That's
just
where the analogy
cut this
of
guy off.
the butterfly's wings flapping over there creates a big tsunami effect over here. It's just to give you the impression that small effects can have big changes in the world. And it's maybe a cascading effect, but that's where I wanted to finish, just tying up a few little things with how the Schumann resonance might be the key to all of this. And it's something worth keeping our eye on because we are neurologically and hormonally
if you
connected
can't get to the link, go to my Twitter
which also
profile.
means our performance,
I already
our
retweeted it.
capabilities as a species is connected to it. And of course, there's the T. Townsend Brown connection with all this, which we need to start taking all these separate strings and start weaving together a pattern that's for the public. Because clearly, as Ashton has pointed out, there's very good indication that there's a pretty good picture of how this works through the billions of dollars that have been spent in private labs, and it's time they have no way of.
Okay, I can't listen anymore. Guys, so check out my Twitter profile, guys. You can do a little bit of work. You can go to my Twitter profile. You can find the X stream right now. Ian Carroll's live with me right now. I want to go listen to that. We've been in here for half an hour longer than I was going to be. Thank you guys for joining this stream. I appreciate it. Again, go over to Ian Carroll. Go to the either his Twitter or my Twitter. You can see the stream. It's live right now. We're talking about the Kona Blue. We're talking about some of these papers as well.
Very much for the space, and thank you for everybody for chipping in. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Holocypher. Appreciate you, man. And I don't know much about the Schumann resonance, but it does seem interesting. Balbazar talks about it. If it's a secret, then that's great. I just want to thank everybody for being here. Thank Jake Chansley for putting this together, for talking about this stuff. Thanks, Holocypher, for bringing up your insights. Everybody else who answered questions as well. I do have to drop, but this has been an awesome conversation, and I look forward to doing more. Make sure you're following all the speakers on here, following Jake, following Holocypher, the rest of us. Make sure you're sharing the information with as many people as possible. And if you are interested after this, come check out the live stream that's going on. It's pre-recording with Ian Carroll, who I think is, in my opinion, probably the best investigative journalist on the planet. We actually do talk about one of these papers in there as well. So thank you guys very much. Have a good one.
Thank you, Ashton. God bless.
Okay, we're
Before
dropping
you
off.
go, Ashton, at some point in the future, I'll have an orb story for you.
Oops. Well, oops, too late. Dropped. Okay, guys, thank you very much today for this stream. Jump over to the Ian Carroll one. Listen to us there. I'll be in the chat. You can chat with me, guys, if you want. Have a great night, MH370X. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, everybody in the chat. Appreciate you guys. Peace.